Hey everyone, and welcome back to History Simplified. Today, we're talking about that time when the United States looked at its citizens having a nice, cold beer after a long day and said, absolutely not. We are diving headfirst into Prohibition, the 13-year national hangover when America tried to outlaw fun and accidentally created the modern criminal empire. Think of it as the world's most disastrous wellness trend, where the entire country went on a detox diet and the withdrawal symptoms included Tommy guns and car chases. This wasn't just a bad law. It was a nationwide group project where half the participants wanted to ban booze and the other half immediately started a black market to sell it to them. Yes, we are about to boil down decades of complex social, religious, and economic turmoil into a single, high-speed narrative for a deeply nuanced, academically rigorous analysis. You should probably be reading a textbook for the version that makes you yell, "Why would they do that?" at your dashboard. You're in the right place. Before the inevitable betrayal starts, if you enjoy this highly inaccurate but fun version of history, please hit that like and subscribe button. Seriously, it helps us buy more silly hats for the next video. Alright, grab some popcorn. Things are about to get unnecessarily complicated. So, how does a nation famous for a rebellion over taxes on tea suddenly decide to ban alcohol entirely? It didn't happen overnight. It was a slow burn. A century-long, nagging, judgmental slow burn that started with a genuine problem. In the early 1800s, America was hammered constantly. The average American was drinking nearly 3 times the amount of pure alcohol we do today. Whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was a morning ritual, a lunchtime pick-me-up, and the only clean thing to drink in many places. Water was suspect, milk was risky, but whiskey was safe and powerful. The workday included grog breaks, which is exactly what it sounds like. America was a nation of functioning, and often non-functioning, alcoholics. Naturally, some people started to think this might be a problem. The first pushback wasn't for a total ban. It was for temperance, a quaint little word that just means moderation. The early temperance movement was basically your one friend who suggests a sober October. They were all about personal pledges, gentle persuasion, and encouraging people to maybe, just maybe, not start their day with a pint of rye. The American Temperance Society, formed in 1826, was all about this vibe. They were the nice guys. They asked politely, and for a while, it sort of worked. Millions of people took the pledge. But pretty please stop drinking so much does have the same fire and brimstone appeal. As every drop of liquor is a ticket to eternal damnation, the movement got an upgrade, or a downgrade. Depending on your perspective, it became radicalized. The goal shifted from moderation to total abstinence. This is where the fun starts. The new leaders of the movement weren't suggesting you switch to water. They wanted to smash every barrel of beer and burn every distillery to the ground. Enter the foot soldiers of the Dry Crusade. Groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or WCTU, became a powerhouse. They framed alcohol as the ultimate evil, the dragon that needed slaying to protect the sanctity of the American home. And their most famous, or infamous, champion was a woman named Carrie Nation. Carrie wasn't into writing letters or quiet protest. Her tools were righteous fury and a hatchet. Seriously, she would walk into saloons, Bible in one hand, hatchet in the other, and proceed to smash the entire place to bits, singing hymns while terrified patrons scrambled for the exits. She called it hatchetation, because of course she did. Now, it's easy to paint these people as joyless fanatics, but their anger came from a real place. The saloon was the center of a lot of social ills. Here's the chain reaction that lit the fuse. Cause: the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Men left farms for factories, lived in crowded cities, and got paid in cash. The saloon was often the only social club available, the place where you could cash your check, get a free lunch, and of course, drink away your meager wages. Effect: this led to a devastating cycle of poverty and domestic violence. Husbands would drink their family's grocery money, stumble home drunk, and create misery for women, who at the time had virtually no legal or economic power. The saloon was a literal monster that devoured their husbands and their family's security. Consequence: the fight against alcohol became inseparable from the fight for women's rights and family safety. It transformed from a simple public health issue into a high-stakes moral crusade. The temperance movement now had a powerful, emotionally resonant story. They weren't just anti-booze, they were pro-family, pro-God, and pro-America. This moral high ground was a political goldmine. The movement wasn't just about smashing up bars anymore. It got smarter, it got organized, it started to focus on the real prize, political power. They realized that yelling at drunk people was less effective than electing politicians who would pass laws to shut the bars down for them. They started endorsing candidates, lobbying Congress, and publishing mountains of propaganda that linked alcohol to every problem in society: crime, poverty, laziness, and even, somehow, bad posture. Probably, this brings us to one of the central ironies of this whole mess. The movement to ban alcohol was, for its time, incredibly progressive. It was deeply intertwined with other social reform movements, including the push for women's suffrage. The logic was simple: if women got the right to vote, they would overwhelmingly vote to outlaw the substance that was destroying their homes, in their minds. The ballot box was the biggest hatchet of all. Let's just pause and appreciate the sheer, magnificent audacity of this whole enterprise. This wasn't a call for better regulation or higher taxes. This was a movement that looked at a multi-billion-dollar industry, a cornerstone of social life for centuries, and decided its only acceptable state was total annihilation. It's the ultimate expression of "I know what's better for you than you do," scaled up to the level of federal law. It's like watching your friend who just discovered keto try to get a constitutional amendment banning carbohydrates. Except they were starting to win. They had the passion, they had the moral argument, and they had a growing army of voters. But they were still missing one crucial piece: a political machine as ruthless and efficient as a mob boss. They needed an organization that could turn all that righteous fury into actual, unbreakable law. And that organization was just around the corner, ready to take the reins and drive the entire country right off a cliff. So, the temperance movement had passion and a righteous cause, but passion doesn't write laws. For that, you need calloused, calculating political operatives. You need an organization that treats politics not as a debate over ideas, but as a street fight. Enter the Anti-Saloon League. If the WCTU was the heart of the dry movement, the Anti-Saloon League was its cold, calculating brain and its brass knuckles. Founded in 1893, these guys were a different breed entirely. They weren't a political party. They were something far more dangerous, a single-issue pressure group. They called themselves the Church, in action against the saloon, which sounds noble until you realize their tactics were anything but their unofficial motto might as well have been, "We don't care about anything else." Seriously, tax policy, foreign affairs, economic theory, irrelevant. The League's position on any given politician came down to a single, brutal question: how will you vote on alcohol? If you were a dry, they would mobilize heaven and earth to get you elected. If you were a wet, they would dedicate their entire existence to destroying your political career. They were the prototype for every modern, laser-focused lobbying group that terrifies Washington, D.C. today. They were the political terminators of their time, and their target was booze. The architect of this ruthless machine was a man named Wayne Wheeler. Wheeler was not a fiery preacher. He was a lawyer, a strategist, and a political animal of the highest order. He had no charisma, but he had something better: an encyclopedic knowledge of political leverage. He invented a strategy that became known as Wheelerism, and it was terrifyingly effective. It was a masterclass in how a motivated, organized minority can bend a disorganized, indifferent majority to its will. First, Wheeler and the ASL perfected the art of propaganda. They didn't just print a few pamphlets, they ran a full-blown media empire. They owned their own printing presses that churned out an endless torrent of books, flyers, and newspaper articles. They hired an army of speakers to travel the country, delivering fiery sermons against the evils of demon rum. Their propaganda was a brilliant mix of shoddy science, emotional blackmail, and outright lies. They published charts proving that alcohol consumption led to insanity. They printed heartbreaking cartoons of little girls in rags begging their fathers to leave the saloon. They crafted a narrative so powerful and so pervasive that it became fact in the minds of millions. Then came the political hardball. The League built a nationwide network, using Protestant churches as their local headquarters. This gave them an army of volunteers and a direct line to millions of voters. Before an election, they'd send questionnaires to every candidate. Their answers would be published and distributed to every churchgoer in the district. The message was clear: this man is with God, and this man is with the devil. It was brutally effective. This is the cause and effect chain that changed American politics forever. Cause: previous temperance movements focused on changing individual hearts and minds, which was slow and inefficient. The ASL recognized that the true power lay not with the voters, but with the politicians who could be bullied. Effect: Wheeler pioneered a new strategy: political intimidation. The ASL created a massive database on every politician, their voting records, their personal habits, their hidden skeletons. They used this information to apply relentless pressure. threatening to expose secrets or run a rival candidate if they didn't fall in line. Consequence: the fear of the anti-saloon league became the dominant force in American politics. Politicians who personally enjoyed a drink or who represented wet urban districts were forced to vote dry to survive. The ASL demonstrated that you didn't need to win the popular argument if you could control the legislative process. They held a gun to the head of the political establishment. And let's be clear, this was a hostile takeover. The ASL would find a vulnerable incumbent, run a dry candidate against them in the primary, split the vote, and sometimes allow a third-party candidate to win, all just to prove a point. Defy us and you're finished. They were masters of the political hit job. One senator lamented that the league had spies everywhere, reporting on who was drinking what at private dinner parties. It was a state of political terror. Here's the media commentary on this whole situation. Wayne Wheeler basically invented the modern lobbyist's playbook. It's a work of dark genius. Step 1. Identify a single, emotionally charged issue. Step 2. Mobilize a passionate, vocal base that will vote on that issue alone. Step 3. Create a system to reward your friends and mercilessly punish your enemies. Step 4. Make politicians so existentially terrified of your organization that they'll pass your legislation just to make you go away. Every powerful special interest group, from the NRA to AARP, owes a debt to the ruthless tactics of the anti-saloon league. They proved that in politics, fear is a much more powerful motivator than love. With Wheeler at the helm, the league went on a winning streak that would be unbelievable if it weren't true. They started at the local level, pushing for county-wide and city-wide prohibition. They won. Then they moved up to the state level. By 1916, nearly half of the states in the U.S. were officially dry. The momentum was undeniable. The political map was slowly being painted in the colors of sobriety. They had turned moral outrage into a steamroller that was flattening everything in its path. The wets, the brewers, the distillers, the saloon owners were shockingly slow to react. They were disorganized, arrogant, and convinced that this moral crusade was just a temporary fad. They couldn't imagine a world where the government would actually shut them down. By the time they realized the anti-saloon league was not just a nuisance, but an existential threat, it was far too late. The league already had Congress in a stranglehold. The stage was set for the final act. The ASL had the political machine, they had the momentum, and they had the fear of God instilled in politicians across the land. All they needed was one final, cataclysmic event to push them over the top, a national crisis so profound that it would make banning alcohol seem not just like a good idea, but a patriotic imperative. They needed a reason to wrap their cause in the American flag. That reason was about to arrive, carried on the winds of war from across the Atlantic. The anti-saloon league had the political machine revved and ready to go. They had congressmen shaking in their boots. But to pass something as monumentally audacious as a constitutional amendment, they needed a tidal wave of public support. A national emergency that would make banning booze seem not just reasonable, but necessary. In April 1917, they got their wish. The United States officially entered World War I, and for Wayne Wheeler and the ASL, it was like Christmas, the Super Bowl, and your birthday all rolled into one. War was the ultimate opportunity. Overnight, the entire debate shifted. The ASL, in a move of pure political genius, seamlessly merged their crusade with the war effort. Their arguments were simple, brutal, and almost impossible to counter in the hyper-patriotic atmosphere of the time. First, there was the issue of food. America wasn't just feeding its own soldiers. It was responsible for feeding its European allies. Suddenly, every bushel of barley and every pound of grain became a strategic resource. The ASL plastered the country with posters screaming, "Shall the many have food or the few have drink?" They framed every bottle of beer as bread snatched from the mouth of a starving child or a heroic soldier. Drinking was no longer just a sin, it was a traitorous act of waste. If that wasn't effective enough, they went for an even lower blow: xenophobia. Who, after all, were the most famous brewers in America? Pabst, Schlitz, Miller, and Anheuser-Busch. The name sounded suspiciously German. The ASL launched a vicious campaign to paint the entire American brewing industry as a tentacle of the German Empire. They called beer Kaiser's Brew. They spread rumors that German-American brewers were using their saloons as meeting places for spies and saboteurs. They suggested that brewers were a fifth column, deliberately trying to make American workers drunk and inefficient to sabotage the war effort. It was baseless, it was racist, and it worked perfectly. In the fever pitch of war, where sauerkraut was being renamed Liberty, cabbage in schools stopped teaching the German language. This was a political nuke. The brewers were completely blindsided. How do you defend yourself against accusations of treason? They had donated millions to the war effort. Their sons were enlisting in the army. But it didn't matter. The ASL had successfully branded them as the enemy within. Now, let's watch this political masterstroke unfold in a clear sequence. Cause, the US entered World War I, unleashing a perfect storm of patriotism, resource conservation, and intense anti-German sentiment across the nation. Effect, the Anti-Saloon League brilliantly weaponized this atmosphere. They transformed their moral crusade into a patriotic one, arguing that prohibition was essential to win the war by saving grain and eliminating the influence of disloyal German-American brewers. Consequence, the political ground vanished beneath the feet of anyone opposing prohibition. To vote against the dry law was now tantamount to treason. Politicians were faced with a simple choice: support prohibition or be branded a pro-German, food-wasting traitor in the next election. The opposition was effectively silenced. With the opposition neutralized, the ASL moved in for the kill. They didn't just want a temporary ban, they wanted a permanent one, etched into the very fabric of the nation. They pushed for a constitutional amendment. Using the unstoppable momentum of the war, they strong-armed Congress. The Lever Food and Fuel Control Act of 1917 was their trial run, a wartime measure that banned the production of distilled spirits. This set the precedent. The federal government could and would intervene. Just a few months later, in December 1917, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution was put to a vote. It was a shockingly simple text, just two short sentences, that proposed to ban the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors in the United States. In the climate of fear, patriotism, and political intimidation, it sailed through. The House voted 282 to 128 in favor. The Senate 65 to 20. The fight in Washington was over. Now it was up to the states to ratify it. This is a moment that demands a meta commentary on political opportunism. The ASL's strategy during World War I is one of the most cynical and effective political maneuvers in American history. They looked at a global conflict, a source of immense suffering and death, and saw it as the ultimate marketing campaign. They took a domestic social issue and successfully disguised it as a wartime necessity. It is a chilling lesson in how fear and nationalism can be used to push through a radical agenda. That would have been unthinkable in peacetime. They wrapped their agenda in the flag, and anyone who questioned it was immediately accused of desecrating it. The amendment was now in the hands of the state legislatures. And this is where the ASL's decades of groundwork paid off. They had spent years getting dry candidates elected to state houses all across the country. Their national network went into overdrive, while most of America was focused on the battlefields of France. The ASL was fighting and winning the final battles for ratification back home. The Wets were still reeling, disorganized and demoralized. They barely put up a fight. State after state fell like dominoes. Mississippi was the first. Then came Virginia, Kentucky, South Carolina. They were racking them up with breathtaking speed. By January of 1919, just 13 months after Congress had passed it, Nebraska became the 36th state to ratify the 18th Amendment. It was done. It was the law of the land. The Anti-Saloon League, after a relentless 30-year fight, had won total victory. They had done the impossible. They had made America a dry nation. But what did that actually mean? Intoxicating liquor sounds straightforward, but in law, words are everything. How much alcohol makes a beverage intoxicating? 0.5%, 1%, 3.2%. The amendment itself didn't say. It was a broad statement of principle. A giant thou shalt not with no details, for the nitty-gritty, for the actual rules of the road. Congress had to pass a separate enabling act. This piece of legislation would define the terms, set the penalties, and create the machinery for enforcement. It would become known as the Volstead Act, and it would contain the very loopholes and contradictions that would turn this noble experiment into a national catastrophe. So, the deed was done. The 18th Amendment was cemented into the Constitution, a permanent monument to the Anti-Saloon League's victory. But a constitutional amendment is like a mission statement. It's the big, flashy promise. It doesn't get into the weeds of how you're actually going to execute it. For that, you need the fine print. You need the soul-crushing, bureaucratic details. You need the National Prohibition Act, better known by the name of the poor schmuck who sponsored it, the Volstead Act. This bill was the instruction manual for a dry America, and it was mostly written not by Congressman Andrew Volstead, but by our old friend Wayne Wheeler of the Anti-Saloon League. This was his victory lap, his chance to design the legal architecture of his dream society. And like a software developer who has spent way too long on a passion project, he made it incredibly powerful, ridiculously specific, and full of bugs that would crash the entire system. First and foremost, the Volstead Act had to define what intoxicating liquor actually meant. The brewers and vintners were hoping for a reasonable compromise. Maybe hard liquor would be banned, but beer and wine, with their lower alcohol content, would be spared. They argued that these were the drinks of moderation, the beverages of the common man and the family table. That was a cute, optimistic thought. Wayne Wheeler was having none of it. He pushed for the most extreme, draconian definition possible. A beverage was deemed intoxicating if it contained more than 0.5% alcohol by volume, 0.5%. Let's put that in perspective. A standard light beer today has about 4.2% alcohol. A regular beer is closer to 5%. Even kombucha, the wellness blogger's drink of choice, can sometimes exceed that limit. This definition was so absurdly strict that it effectively banned everything. By drawing this line in the sand, the ASL declared war not just on whiskey-soaked saloons, but on every single American who enjoyed a casual beer after work. It was a declaration of total war. But here is where the story takes a hard left turn into sheer legislative insanity. For all its strictness, the Volstead Act contained a series of loopholes so massive you could drive a fleet of booze-filled trucks through them. And the biggest one was this: the law made it illegal to manufacture, sell, or transport alcohol. It did not make it illegal to buy or drink alcohol. Read that again. It was perfectly legal to have a drink. It was just a federal crime to get the drink in the first place. This wasn't an oversight, it was a deliberate political calculation. The Dries knew they didn't have the votes to pass a law that would punish the average citizen for having a glass of wine with dinner. That was a step too far, even for them, so they created a legal paradox that would become the fatal flaw of the entire experiment. They created a law that punished the supplier, but not the consumer. They basically green-lit demand while criminalizing supply. Here's the cause and effect chain that set up the entire disaster. Cause in drafting the Volstead Act. The Anti-Saloon League created a law riddled with contradictions. It was absurdly strict on the definition of alcohol, 0.5%, but critically silent on the act of consumption. Effect: this sent a confusing and ultimately permissive signal to the public. It established a system where the government wagged its finger at drinkers, while reserving actual punishment for those who provided the drinks. A massive, nationwide demand for alcohol remained perfectly legal. Consequence: the act didn't eliminate the alcohol market, it just handed a government-guaranteed, tax-free monopoly to anyone willing to break the law. It was an engraved invitation for criminals to become entrepreneurs, creating the perfect conditions for a black market to erupt on an unprecedented scale. And the loopholes kept coming. The law stated that any alcoholic beverages owned before the amendment took effect were legal to keep and consume in one's private home. This kicked off the world's most decadent shopping spree. Anyone with money, which is to say, most of the wealthy lawmakers who voted for this thing, ran out and bought up the entire inventory of liquor stores and wineries. The Vanderbilt family reportedly stocked their cellar with enough liquor to last a lifetime. The law had a class-based escape hatch from day one. Prohibition was for the poor, not for the rich, who could afford to hoard. Then there were the official exemptions. The Volstead Act didn't apply to alcohol used for medicinal, industrial, or sacramental purposes. This sounded reasonable on paper. In reality, it was a joke. Suddenly, every doctor in America was prescribing whiskey for everything from anxiety to a sore throat. The number of rabbinical licenses to produce sacramental wine exploded, and the amount of industrial-grade alcohol being produced for use in perfumes, paints, and solvents would soon be diverted in massive quantities to be redistilled into bathtub gin. Even President Woodrow Wilson, who had gone along with wartime prohibition, saw that this bill was a train wreck. He vetoed it, calling it a piece of extreme and unenforceable legislation. It was a noble gesture. It was also completely futile. The Anti-Saloon League's power over Congress was absolute. Within hours of Wilson's veto, both the House and the Senate voted to override him with massive, veto-proof majorities. The bill became law. The die was cast. Let's just marvel at the beautiful absurdity of this legal framework. The Volstead Act is a monument to trying to have it both ways. It's a law that tries to enforce absolute sobriety while simultaneously winking and saying, but you know, if you happen to have some booze, go right ahead. It is like passing a law against speeding, but making it legal to own a Ferrari and legal to drive fast, as long as no one sells you the gas. You haven't solved the problem, you've just created a booming black market for gasoline. This wasn't a noble experiment, it was a badly designed one, destined to blow up on the launch pad. With the law in place, the clock started ticking. The 18th Amendment was scheduled to take effect 1 year after its ratification. The date was set, January 17, 1920. As 1919 drew to a close, America braced for impact. The final days were a nationwide party. Saloons held mock funerals for John Barleycorn, their symbolic mascot. People threw last-call parties that raged for days. And all across the country, anyone with a spare dollar was buying and hoarding booze. Preparing for the great thirst to come, the nation was about to step off a cliff into a 13-year bender of crime, corruption, and chaos, and it all started tomorrow. The clock struck midnight. January 17, 1920. It was official. The party was over. Across America, the last legal drinks were drained, the last kegs were tapped, and the doors to thousands of saloons swung shut for what was supposed to be forever. The great noble experiment had begun. The supporters of Prohibition were ecstatic. They saw this as the dawn of a new, purified America. The famous evangelist Billy Sunday held a mock funeral for John Barleycorn in front of 10,000 cheering followers, proclaiming, "The slums will soon be only a memory. We will turn our prisons into factories and our jails into storehouses." Church bells rang, people held prayer vigils. They genuinely believed they had slain the beast of alcohol, and were about to enter a golden age of prosperity and virtue. This glorious vision of a sober utopia lasted for about 5 minutes for the rest of America. The morning of January 17th wasn't a moment of spiritual awakening. It was a moment of deep confusion, followed immediately by a frantic search for a workaround. The country woke up with a collective hangover and one burning question. Okay, so how do we get a drink now? The Volstead Act, with its glorious, gaping loopholes, provided the initial answers. The law that was supposed to dry up the country was, in reality, more like a leaky faucet, and a thirsty nation immediately put a bucket under every drip. The first and most popular workaround was medicinal liquor. Suddenly, the nation was gripped by a plague of mysterious ailments, for which the only known cure was a government-approved pint of whiskey. Doctors, who could legally write prescriptions for spirits, became the most popular men in town. Their waiting rooms were flooded with people complaining of anxiety, insomnia, snake bites, and general malaise. For a couple of bucks, you could walk out with a script and head down to the local pharmacy, which now looked suspiciously like a well-stocked liquor store, to get your medicine. The number of licensed pharmacists tripled. In some cities, it was a miracle of modern medicine. Then there was the sacramental wine exemption. Coincidentally, America experienced a massive religious revival. Applications for licenses to produce wine for religious ceremonies exploded. Men who had never seen the inside of a synagogue suddenly felt a deep spiritual calling to become rabbis. The demand for communion wine became so astronomical that one official wryly noted that if it were all being used for its intended purpose, every communicant in the country must be taking their sacrament in a bathtub. But these were just the legalish gray areas. The real action was happening in the shadows. On the very first day of Prohibition, the black market was born. It wasn't a sophisticated operation yet. It was more like an impromptu bake sale for booze. Former saloon owners, sitting on a now illegal inventory, started quietly selling bottles out of their back doors to trusted customers. People with well-stocked private sellers realized their collection was now worth a fortune and started selling to their less prepared neighbors. This was the startup phase of bootlegging, small, decentralized, and driven by pure, unadulterated demand. This leads us to the spectacular failure that defined the entire era: enforcement. Cause the federal government, having passed this monumental piece of social engineering, allocated a laughably insignificant budget and workforce to enforce it. The new Prohibition unit was given about 1,500 agents to police the entire country. Effect, with so few agents, who were also notoriously underpaid and often politically appointed, the actual risk of getting caught was minuscule. An agent in a rural state might be responsible for thousands of square miles. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and immediately targeted with bribes that were often worth more than their annual salary. Consequence, the law was effectively unenforceable from day one. This created a low-risk, high-reward environment that was a flashing green light for anyone with a criminal inclination. The government's abject failure to create a credible enforcement threat created a power vacuum that more organized, more violent, and more ambitious criminal enterprises would gleefully fill. The sheer, staggering naivete of the dry movement is something to behold. They truly believed that passing the law was the end of the story. They thought that once drinking was illegal, the nation's thirst would just magically vanish. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. They approached a deeply ingrained cultural tradition as if it were a simple switch they could just flip to the off position. They never stopped to think about what would happen when millions of people who didn't see their evening beer as a moral failing were suddenly branded as criminals. They thought they were closing the book on alcohol. Instead, they were opening the door for Al Capone. As the first few weeks of the Great Experiment unfolded, a new reality began to set in. The utopian promises of the Anti-Saloon League were not materializing. Jails weren't emptying. In fact, they were about to get a lot more crowded. The country wasn't getting more virtuous. It was just getting better at hiding its vices. The demand for alcohol hadn't disappeared. It had just been driven underground. This created a massive business opportunity. The nation was thirsty, and the legalish loopholes were not enough to satisfy that thirst. What America needed was a new institution, a place where people could gather, socialize, and defiantly have a drink. The old-time saloon was dead, a casualty of the moral crusade, but something new was about to rise from its ashes. Something hidden, something illicit, and something that would come to define the glamour and danger of the Roaring Twenties. The age of the speakeasy was about to begin. America was thirsty, and the legalish workarounds were just a trickle when what the nation needed was a flood. A new institution was required. The old-time saloon was dead to public, to mail, too easy for the feds to raid. The country needed a place to drink that was secret, exclusive, and most importantly, available. In the back alleys and basements of every city in America, an answer emerged: the speakeasy. And it would change American culture forever. The concept was simple. Find an unassuming location, a basement, a disguised storefront, the back room of a flower shop. Put a reinforced door on it with a tiny sliding peephole. Hire a very large man to guard it. And then spread the word. To get in, you needed to know the secret knock, or the password, or just know the right person. You had to speak easy when you mentioned the place in public, keeping your voice down to avoid attracting the attention of the police. It wasn't just a bar, it was a secret society for the thirsty. This secrecy and illegality gave the speakeasy a thrill that the old saloons never had. Getting a drink was now an act of rebellion, a little adventure. And this adventure wasn't just for men anymore. This was the single most revolutionary aspect of the speakeasy. Pre-Prohibition saloons were almost exclusively male spaces. A respectable woman would never be caught dead in one, but speakeasies? They welcomed women with open arms. Women had money. Women had a newfound sense of freedom after getting the vote. And women wanted a drink just as much as men did. The speakeasy became the first co-ed drinking establishment in American history. The result was a cultural explosion. Prohibition didn't kill the bar scene. It made it multiply like a virus. Before Prohibition, New York City had about 15,000 legal saloons. Walking into a speakeasy was a surreal experience. You'd approach a quiet, unmarked door on a dark street. Give the password. Swordfish. Gus sent me. Whatever the code of the week was. The peephole would slide open. A pair of suspicious eyes would look you over, and then, with a clunk of heavy bolts, the door would swing inward. You'd step out of the quiet, sober world of legal America and into a parallel universe of joyful anarchy. The air would be thick with smoke, the room roaring with conversation, a jazz band wailing in the corner, and flappers in short skirts and bobbed hair dancing with men in sharp suits. It was the sound of a nation defiantly having a good time, of course. The quality of the drinks was another story. With no government regulation and a desperate need to stretch supply, the alcohol was often horrifying. The cocktails we know today, the martini, the Tom Collins, the gin Ricky, became wildly popular during this era, not just because they were sophisticated, but because they were necessary. A healthy dose of juice, bitters, or vermouth was essential to mask the foul chemical taste of the illegally produced booze, often called bathtub gin or rot gut whiskey. This new social scene leads to one of the most ironic consequences in American history. Cause, by making all public drinking illegal, Prohibition destroyed the traditional, male-only saloon culture. Effect, entrepreneurs created a new type of hidden establishment, the speakeasy, which, to maximize profits and minimize risk, needed to be discreet and welcoming to a wider, co-ed clientele. This brought men and women together to drink socially for the first time. Consequence, the speakeasy became the engine of a massive social revolution. It normalized public drinking for women, fueled the rise of the liberated flapper, and made jazz the music of Black America the official soundtrack of the new, integrated urban nightlife. Prohibition inadvertently created the modern dating scene. Let's just take a moment to savor the beautiful, spectacular irony of this. The architects of Prohibition were staunch, traditionalist moralists. They were trying to reinforce Victorian values and strengthen the patriarchal family structure. Their goal was to get men out of the bar and back into the home. Instead, their law destroyed the old boys club and replaced it with a co-ed, cocktail-fueled party that launched the jazz age. They set out to write a hymn and accidentally composed a riotous jazz solo. It is, without a doubt, the greatest cell phone in the history of social policy. They swung a sledgehammer to fix a leaky faucet and ended up flooding the entire house. Except the flood was made of gin and good times. The speakeasy culture spread like wildfire, a defiant middle finger to the federal government. But as these thousands upon thousands of secret bars flourished, they all faced the same critical problem: supply chain management. A speakeasy is just a room with thirsty people in it if you can't get any booze. The initial supplies, the hoarded liquor from 1919 and the trickle from medicinal prescriptions, were drying up fast. The demand was now enormous, organized, and concentrated in these new social hubs. What was needed was an equally organized supply. The era of the amateur was over. The market was calling for professionals, people who could brew, distill, smuggle, and transport alcohol on an industrial scale. The nation's thirst had created a multi-billion-dollar vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed a new generation of entrepreneurs. From backwoods distillers to amateur chemists, and most ominously, the gangsters who saw this not as a party, but as the business opportunity of a lifetime. The supply side of the black market was about to get very creative and very dangerous. The speakeasy network was booming, a nationwide web of secret parties demanding a constant flow of alcohol. But where was it all supposed to come from? Before the gangster-run mega corporations took over, the first answer for millions of Americans was simple: if you can't buy it, make it yourself. Prohibition kicked off the greatest and most dangerous DIY movement in the nation's history. America turned its kitchens, basements, and yes, bathtubs into amateur breweries and distilleries. The Volstead Act, in its infinite wisdom, had left a convenient loophole. It was illegal to make beer, but it was perfectly fine to make non-intoxicating fruit juices at home. This was a national inside joke. Stores that once sold wine-making equipment now sold grape bricks, blocks of concentrated grape juice. These bricks came with a prominent, comical warning label that read something like, "Caution, do not dissolve this brick in a gallon of water with a cup of sugar and leave it in a dark closet for 3 weeks, because it will result in an alcoholic beverage that is illegal to possess." Wink, wink. Sales of grape concentrate shot up by over 400%. Every Italian grandfather in America suddenly became a potential federal criminal. Beer was even easier. Grocery stores started selling cans of malt syrup, a key ingredient for brewing. The cans were marketed as a baking ingredient, with helpful suggestions on the label like, "Do not mix with yeast and hops and store in a warm place." The sales of hops and yeast skyrocketed. It was a nationwide, coordinated effort of malicious compliance. A whole generation of Americans learned basic chemistry in the name of getting a buzz. But making your own wine and beer was one thing. It was relatively safe. The real danger, and the source of Prohibition's most infamous drinks, came from home distilling. People didn't just want wine and beer, they wanted the hard stuff. They wanted gin and whiskey. And to get that, you had to play with fire. This is the era of bathtub gin. Now, to be clear, it wasn't usually made in a bathtub. The name came from the process. People would get a large container of alcohol, often industrial-grade stuff diverted from factories, and mix it with water and flavorings. Because the containers were often too tall to fit under a kitchen sink faucet, they'd fill them with water from the tub. The starting ingredient was the real problem. The most common source was denatured industrial alcohol, which was alcohol that had been deliberately poisoned by the government with chemicals to make it undrinkable. Amateur chemists, operating on rumor and bad science, would then try to renature this alcohol, running it through filters or adding other chemicals to remove the poison. Then they'd add juniper oil and maybe a little glycerin for smoothness and bottle it as gin. The result was a foul-tasting concoction that could make you sick on a good day and kill you on a bad one. This is the central health crisis of Prohibition, the point where the government's good intentions became actively lethal. Cause, Prohibition completely eliminated the supply of safe, legally manufactured and regulated hard liquor, which millions of people still wanted to drink. Effect, this created a massive, unregulated cottage industry of amateur distillation. These DIY distillers used dangerous ingredients like poison, industrial alcohol, and crude equipment, leading to the creation of toxic rot gut liquor contaminated with methanol and other poisons. Consequence, the United States suffered a catastrophic public health crisis. An estimated 10,000 people died from drinking tainted alcohol during Prohibition, and many thousands more were left permanently blind or paralyzed. The noble experiment to improve public health had made drinking exponentially more dangerous, Methanol, or wood alcohol, was the primary killer. It's a natural byproduct of distillation, but professional distilleries have the equipment and knowledge to remove it. Your neighbor brewing hooch in his garage did not. Methanol is a vicious poison. It attacks the central nervous system. With a particular fondness for the optic nerve, drink enough of it, and you go blind. Drink a little more, and you die. Newspapers were filled with horrific stories of entire wedding parties being struck blind, or groups of friends dying after sharing a bottle of bad hooch. This wasn't a rare occurrence. It was a constant, terrifying risk of drinking in the 1920s. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate the sheer, weapons-grade irony here. The entire century-long push for prohibition was based on the idea that alcohol was a poison that destroyed public health. The government banned it to protect people, and in doing so, they created a situation where the only available alcohol was a literal, fast-acting poison. They replaced the regulated products of companies like Jack Daniel's and Anheuser-Busch with toxic sludge brewed in a bucket by a guy named Earl who's just hoping he doesn't blow up his garage. It's a public health initiative that functions like a game of Russian roulette. It is one of the most spectacular, tragic, and utterly predictable failures in government history. Eventually, the novelty and the terror of DIY booze started to wear thin. People got tired of drinking stuff that tasted like nail polish remover and carried a non-zero chance of making their eyes stop working. The demand for real alcohol professionally made, safely distilled, and not brewed in a shed was higher than ever. People would pay a premium for quality. This created the perfect business opportunity. The amateur hour was over. The market was calling for a more professional, more reliable supplier. This wasn't a job for home brewers anymore. This was a job for smugglers, for hijackers, for people with boats and trucks and connections. It was a job for people who weren't afraid to break the law on a massive, organized scale. The DIY disaster of bathtub gin had laid the groundwork for the rise of the bootlegger, who could promise a thirsty nation something far more valuable than just a buzz, a drink that probably wouldn't kill you. The nation was gagging on bathtub gin, and the demand for anything that wasn't brewed in a garage was at a fever pitch. This was no longer a job for amateurs. This was a market gap waiting for a professional. Enter the bootlegger. The term itself was an old one, born from the practice of hiding flasks in the tops of one's boots. But the 1920s would elevate the bootlegger from a petty crook to a captain of industry. In the beginning, it was a chaotic free-for-all. The first bootleggers were scrappy opportunists. A fisherman with a fast boat might make a nighttime run to a ship waiting in international waters. A guy living near the Canadian border might modify his Ford to carry a few cases of whiskey under a false floor. Former saloon owners who knew the business, small-time thugs who knew how to crack heads, and a whole lot of otherwise ordinary people saw a chance to make life-changing money. The risk was there, but the reward was astronomical. What these early entrepreneurs quickly realized was that they were sitting on the business opportunity of the century. The United States government had just performed an act of magnificent economic stupidity. It had outlawed a product with near universal and elastic demand. It had banned a substance that millions of people considered a daily staple. In modern business terms, the government had just created a multi-billion-dollar market and simultaneously eliminated every single legal competitor. It was a startup founder's dream scenario. The potential customer base was 100 million people, the profit margins were infinite, and the regulatory body, the Prohibition Union, was a broke, corrupt, and incompetent joke. But scaling this startup was going to be a problem. Being an independent bootlegger was tough. First, you had the logistical nightmare: sourcing, smuggling, transporting, warehousing, and distributing millions of gallons of liquor is not a one-man job. You need a supply chain. You need a fleet of boats and trucks. You need a network of safe houses and warehouses. Second, you needed security. Your entire inventory was illegal, untraceable, and incredibly valuable. That made you a prime target for other criminals who would rather hijack your fully loaded truck than go to the trouble of smuggling their own. This is where violence became a non-negotiable business expense. You needed muscle to protect your product, your roots, and your sales territory. This is the exact moment when American crime leveled up. Cause the bootlegging business was immensely profitable, but also logistically complex and dangerously violent, making it impossible for small, independent operators to survive for long. Effect: to manage the challenges of scale and security, small-time criminal outfits began to consolidate. They formed larger, more structured organizations, syndicates, or gangs to pool their capital, control smuggling routes, fix prices, and enforce their territorial claims with brutal efficiency. Consequence: Prohibition acted as a crucible, forging the modern American mafia. It forced petty criminals to learn the principles of business management, supply chain logistics, personnel, security, and violent mergers and acquisitions. Crime transformed from a collection of street-level hustles into sophisticated, vertically integrated corporate enterprises. The new kingpins of the underworld weren't just thugs. They were CEOs. Men like Arnold Rothstein in New York, the infamous Brain, saw the opportunity immediately. Rothstein was a financier of the underworld. He didn't get his hands dirty. He organized and bankrolled the operations. He treated crime like a portfolio of investments, and bootlegging was his blue-chip stock. He and others like him provided the capital and the organizational genius to turn a scattered black market into a disciplined, terrifyingly efficient industry. They weren't just breaking the law. They were building empires. They set up their organizations just like any other major corporation. They had an import division, the smugglers and rum runners, a transportation division, the truckers and drivers, a manufacturing division for when they needed to cut the good stuff with cheaper raw alcohol, a sales and marketing team, the guys who strong-arm speakeasies into buying their product exclusively, and a legal department, a team of corrupt lawyers, cops, and judges on the payroll. And of course, they had a very active human resources department, which mostly involved hiring men with Tommy guns to handle personnel disputes with the competition. Let's just take a step back and admire the beautiful, horrifying irony of what the US government accomplished here. The noble experiment was, in effect, a massive, federally funded incubator for organized crime. They didn't just fail to stop people from drinking. They actively midwifed the birth of the modern mafia. They handed gangsters a protected, tax-free monopoly on one of the country's biggest industries. All the mob had to do was show up, organize the chaos, and count the money. It was the most successful business plan the American underworld had ever seen, and it was written and signed into law by their greatest enemy, the United States Congress. These new criminal corporations were getting organized, capitalized, and ready to dominate the market. They had the structure and the ambition, but they still needed a steady, reliable source of high-quality product. Bathtub gin wasn't going to cut it for their high-paying customers. They needed the real stuff: Canadian whiskey, Scotch from Scotland, rum from the Caribbean. Their business model depended on a massive international supply chain. To understand how these empires were truly built, we have to look beyond the shores of the United States to the lawless waters of the Atlantic and the very friendly, very thirsty border to the north. The supply was out there, waiting. The newly formed crime syndicates had the organization and the ambition, but they needed a product that wouldn't blind their customers. They needed a steady, reliable source of high-quality, professionally made liquor. The answer wasn't in America's backyards. It was floating just over the horizon. Welcome to Rum Row, the greatest floating black market the world has ever seen. The legal logic was brilliantly simple. In the 1920s, United States territorial waters, the zone where U.S. law applied, extended only 3 miles from the coastline. Beyond that 3-mile limit, you were on the high seas. You were in international waters, and out there, the Volstead Act was just a piece of paper. So, enterprising sea captains from Britain, Canada, and the Bahamas loaded their ships to the brim with cases of the finest Scotch, Canadian whiskey, and Caribbean rum, sailed to the edge of the 3-mile limit, dropped anchor, and waited. They weren't breaking any laws. They were just parking. Soon, a veritable armada of these booze-filled motherships formed a line stretching from the coast of Maine all the way down to Florida, off the coast of New Jersey, within sight of Atlantic City. The fleet was so dense it was nicknamed Rum Row. It was a floating, tax-free liquor superstore, a city of smugglers bobbing patiently in the waves. The lights from the ships were a glittering, taunting reminder to the people on shore of just how close, yet how legally untouchable their forbidden drink was. Of course, the booze wasn't going to swim to shore by itself. This created the second half of the operation. The rum runners, these were the daredevils, the cowboys of the sea. At night, a fleet of small, ridiculously fast contact boats would roar out from hidden coves and quiet inlets along the coast. These boats were masterpieces of Prohibition-era engineering. They were often former fishing vessels or pleasure yachts that had been stripped down and retrofitted with enormous, supercharged engines, often surplus aircraft engines from World War I. They were built for one purpose: to be faster than anything the Coast Guard had. The rum runner would zip out to the mothership, buy cases of liquor with a suitcase full of cash, and then begin the most dangerous part of the journey, the mad dash back to shore. This is where the cat and mouse game began. The U.S. Coast Guard, which up until now had mostly been concerned with saving boaters and maintaining lighthouses was suddenly thrust into the role of a frontline naval police force. And at first, they were hopelessly outgunned and outrun. Their slow, clunky patrol boats were no match for the rum runner's sleek speed machines. A skilled captain could literally run circles around a government cutter, vanishing into the darkness before the Coast Guard even knew what was happening. This maritime operation brings us to a legendary figure, Captain Bill McCoy. McCoy was a former boat builder who became the most famous rum runner of the era. He was renowned for his integrity. In a business filled with crooks who would water down their liquor, McCoy sold only the good stuff, uncut and undiluted. His reputation was so golden that people started asking for his products by name, demanding the real McCoy to ensure they weren't getting swindled. The phrase stuck, a testament to a smuggler who built his brand on quality control. Here's the chain reaction that fueled the East Coast's party. Cause: the combination of a massive U.S. demand for imported liquor and a legal loophole allowing foreign ships to anchor just outside the 3-mile territorial limit created a perfect opportunity for maritime smuggling. Effect: a huge, stationary fleet of foreign liquor wholesalers, known as Rum Row, established itself along the U.S. coastline. This spurred the creation of a sophisticated system of high-speed contact boats to run the product from these offshore sellers to the mainland buyers. Consequence: Rum Row became the primary supply line for high-quality alcohol on the East Coast, turning the coastal waters into a nightly war zone between smugglers and the U.S. Coast Guard. This conflict sparked a technological arms race in naval engineering and made folk heroes out of daring rum runners like Bill McCoy. Eventually, the U.S. government got fed up with being mocked by a floating city of smugglers. They extended the customs waters from 3 miles to 12, pushing Rum Row further out to sea and making the trip for the contact boats longer, more expensive, and more dangerous, especially in bad weather. The Coast Guard also got a massive budget increase, a fleet of their own purpose-built speedboats, and even a few destroyers. The game got harder, but the profits were so immense that the smuggling never stopped. There is a profound, almost comical symbolism to Rum Row. It was the physical embodiment of the law's failure. The government had passed a constitutional amendment to dry up a continent. Yet anyone on the beach in New Jersey could look out and see a traffic jam of ships whose sole purpose was to get America drunk. It was a constant, shimmering, 24/7 reminder that demand will always find a supply. It turned the Atlantic Ocean into the world's biggest back alley, and the Coast Guard was left playing a hopeless game of whack-a-mole on the water. Rum Row was a brilliant solution for supplying coastal cities like New York and Boston, but America is a very big country. What about the vast interior? What about the great cities of the Midwest, hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean? They were just as thirsty. A different kind of supply chain was needed, one that ran on highways and railways, not ocean currents, and this new logistical challenge would require a new level of organization, ruthlessness, and corporate-style genius. The capital of this new, land-based empire would not be on the coast. It would be in the heart of the country, in a city of railroads and stockyards. It was time for Chicago to take center stage. The sea lanes were buzzing, supplying America's coast with a steady stream of high-quality booze. But the heart of the country, the Great Plains and the sprawling cities of the Midwest, remained just as thirsty. This new frontier of the black market required a different kind of logistics, a different kind of organization, and a different kind of leader. The capital of this new inland empire was Chicago, a city practically custom-built for crime, a major transportation hub, a corrupt political machine, and a population that loved to drink. And into this perfect storm walked a young, ambitious, and utterly ruthless thug from Brooklyn, named Alphonse Capone. Al Capone did not start as a kingpin. He arrived in Chicago around 1920 as a hired gun, a bouncer and enforcer for his mentor, Johnny Torrio. Torrio was the brains of the operation. He was a quiet, calculating gangster who saw the chaos of Chicago's warring ethnic gangs not as a problem, but as an opportunity. He had a vision to take the disparate, disorganized rackets of the city and unite them under a single, corporate structure. And with Prohibition, he knew that bootlegging would be the engine of that corporation. Capone was his fiercely loyal and very effective vice president of violent enforcement. Together, Torrio and Capone built a formidable enterprise on Chicago's south side. But the city's old guard, particularly the Irish gangs on the north side, didn't appreciate the new management. The competition was fierce and bloody. In 1925, the North Siders made their move. They ambushed Torrio outside his home, riddling him with bullets. He miraculously survived. But the experience changed him. Shaken and weary of the violence, Johnny Torrio made a decision that would change the course of American crime. He decided to retire, and he handed the keys to his entire, burgeoning empire to his 26-year-old protege. Al Capone was now the CEO. And what a CEO he was! Capone took Torrio's vision and supercharged it with his own unique blend of brutality, business acumen, and public relations savvy. He wasn't just a neighborhood crime boss, he was an innovator. He understood that violence was simply a business tool. It was what you use for hostile takeovers of rival territories, for discouraging employee theft, and for ensuring your customers paid on time. Under his leadership, the Chicago outfit became the most feared and efficient criminal organization in the country. But Capone's true genius lay in his understanding of the system. He knew that bullets were only half the battle, the other half was bribery. He poured money into corrupting the city's infrastructure until it was essentially a subsidiary of his organization. He had hundreds of policemen, detectives, judges, and city officials on his payroll. He bragged that he had the mayor, William Big Bill Thompson, in his pocket. It wasn't an empty boast. During one particularly corrupt election, Capone's men terrorized polling places, ensuring his candidate won. When the feds tried to intervene, Capone's police allies arrested the federal agents. He had created a parallel government, a shadow state that operated with near total impunity. This is the chain reaction that made Capone a legend. Cause: the immense, concentrated profits from bootlegging in a geographically central and politically corrupt city like Chicago created a power vacuum. Effect: a new type of gangster, Al Capone, rose to fill it. He applied a ruthless corporate model to crime, using systematic violence to eliminate competition and massive-scale bribery to neutralize the legal system. Consequence: Capone consolidated Chicago's underworld into the Chicago outfit, a monolithic crime syndicate that effectively controlled the city. He became a national celebrity and the living embodiment of Prohibition's failure. A man who grew richer and more powerful than the government that was supposed to stop him. And the public, strangely enough, kind of loved him for it. This was Capone's other brilliant innovation: public relations. He was the first celebrity gangster. He dressed in flashy suits, drove an armored Cadillac, and was always ready with a quote for the reporters who followed him everywhere. He presented himself not as a violent criminal, but as a public servant. "I am just a businessman," he famously said, giving the people what they want. He opened soup kitchens for the poor during the Great Depression. He donated to charities. He cultivated the image of a benevolent bad guy, a modern-day Robin Hood who was just bucking a stupid, unpopular law. Let's pause on that, because Capone's public image is a crucial part of this story. He became an icon because he was a walking, talking symbol of the era's hypocrisy. While politicians were voting dry in public and drinking whiskey in private, Capone was brutally, refreshingly honest about what he did. He never pretended to be anything other than what he was, a man who got rich by providing a service the government had forbidden. He was the dark reflection of the American dream, a poor immigrant son who, through ambition and ruthless hard work, built a multi-million-dollar empire from nothing. His product just happened to be illegal. Under his leadership, the Chicago outfit was generating an estimated $100 million a year, that's over $1.5 billion in today's money. It was one of the most profitable businesses in America. Capone wasn't just a gangster, he was the king of Chicago, more powerful than the mayor, more famous than any movie star. But how did an operation of this scale actually work? What were the day-to-day mechanics of this criminal corporation? Controlling a city and an entire industry requires more than just charisma and Tommy guns. It requires a sophisticated, well-oiled machine. And Capone's machine was a masterpiece of a legal enterprise. It's time to look under the hood. So, Al Capone is the CEO of the most profitable and violent startup in America. But what does the org chart of a multi-million-dollar bootlegging operation actually look like? How do you manage a supply chain when your entire product line is illegal and your competition uses machine guns for contract negotiations? The answer is that the big syndicates, like Capone's Chicago outfit, structured themselves like any other major corporation. They just had a much higher body count in their quarterly reports. Let's call it the bootlegger's business model, a masterclass in criminal capitalism. Phase 1. Sourcing and manufacturing. First, you need a product. The smart outfits diversified their acquisition strategy. The most glamorous method was smuggling. Fleets of souped-up cars and trucks with reinforced suspension and hidden compartments would make nightly runs across the Canadian border. The Detroit River, separating Detroit from Windsor, Canada, was so busy with smugglers' boats that it became known as the Detroit-Windsor Funnel. This was the import division, bringing in high-end, brand-name whiskey for the discerning customer, but importing is expensive and risky. For a more reliable, high-volume supply, you needed to control production. This is where Capone was a genius. His outfit didn't just buy booze, they made it. They secretly purchased or muscled their way into controlling a number of legitimate breweries. By day, these breweries would produce near beer, the legal, flavorless swill that was under the 0.5% alcohol limit. But at night, a second shift would come in, and the same machinery would churn out thousands of barrels of real, full-strength beer. This is classic vertical integration, and it gave Capone a massive, cost-effective, and locally sourced inventory. Phase 2, logistics and distribution. Now you have millions of gallons of illegal beer and whiskey. How do you move it? With a private army, of course. The outfit operated a fleet of trucks, often armored, driven by men who were paid to be good with both a gear shift and a shotgun. This was the logistics division. Their job was to transport the product from the breweries and secret distilleries to a network of warehouses, garages, and cellars scattered across the city. Each delivery was a high-stakes military convoy, because the #1 rule of the bootlegging business was this: why make it when you can steal it? Hijacking a rival's shipment was a standard business practice, a form of aggressive asset acquisition. From the central warehouses, a fleet of smaller, faster delivery trucks would fan out across the city. This was the last-mile delivery team, bringing the daily supply of booze to the thousands of speakeasies, bars, and brothels that were the outfit's retail customers. Every step of the process, from the grain in the brewery to the glass on the bar, was controlled by the syndicate. Phase 3, market control and sales. This is where the model gets really nasty. How do you ensure that all those speakeasies buy your beer and not someone else's? Simple, you make them an offer they can't refuse. Capone's men would visit a bar owner and offer them their product. If the owner agreed, they became part of the outfit's distribution network. If they refused, or if they were caught selling a competitor's product, their bar would mysteriously be smashed to pieces by men with baseball bats. A second refusal might result in the bar being bombed. There was no third refusal. This wasn't just sales, it was franchising through fear. Bar owners also had to pay a protection fee, a regular tax to the outfit in exchange for the privilege of not being blown up. This entire, horrifyingly efficient machine gives us a perfect cause and effect chain for the professionalization of crime. Cause, in order to dominate the immensely profitable but highly dangerous illegal liquor market, syndicates needed absolute control over every facet of the business. Effect, they pioneered the use of vertical integration in crime, controlling manufacturing, importation, distribution, and retail sales. They protected this structure with industrial-scale bribery and paramilitary violence. Consequence, this corporate model transformed organized crime from a loose collection of rackets into an incredibly wealthy and disciplined illegal economy. It also deeply entangled the syndicates with legitimate businesses, which provided them with the trucks, warehouses, raw materials, and services necessary to operate. And that's the dirty little secret of this whole era. The gangsters couldn't have done it alone. This whole criminal enterprise was greased by the wheels of legitimate commerce. Who do you think sold Capone his fleets of Cadillac sedans and armored trucks? General Motors and Ford. Who rented him the warehouses to store his illegal booze? Respectable real estate agents who were happy to be paid in cash. Who sold the brewers the tons of sugar, grain, and thousands of bottles they needed for their illegal production runs? Regular, law-abiding business suppliers. The entire American economy had a case of moral laryngitis as long as the mob's money was green. Nobody asked where it came from. The bootlegging syndicates had built a parallel economy, a shadow industry that was bigger, more profitable, and often more efficient than many legal ones. They had the money, the power, and the politicians. But what about the law, with local police and judges on the payroll? The only real threat came from the federal government. The feds were outmanned and outgunned, but they did have a few agents who were too stubborn, too strange, or too honest to be bought, and two of them, a bizarre duo of masters of disguise, were about to become the biggest nuisance the New York bootleggers had ever seen. The bootlegging syndicates had built a corporate empire of crime, and the local police were often little more than their privately owned security force. The only real threat came from the federal government's Prohibition unit, but let's be honest, this agency was mostly a punchline. It was a cobbled-together mess of political appointees, underpaid agents, and corrupt officials. They were supposed to be the nation's moral guardians, but most of them couldn't find a speakeasy if you gave them the password and a map. Most of them. But there were exceptions. And in New York City, There were the agents who were so exceptionally good at their jobs that they became legends. They were the Feds to Men Army, Izzy Einstein and Mo Smith. Izzy and Mo were not what you'd picture when you think of federal agents. They weren't chiseled, grim-faced G-men. They were both middle-aged, portly, Jewish immigrants from the Lower East Side. Izzy was a former postal clerk. Mo owned a cigar store. They looked less like lawmen and more like a couple of guys on their way to a pinochle game. And that was their superpower. No bootlegger in their right mind would ever suspect these two schleps of being the Feds. Their secret weapon was a combination of theatrical genius and linguistic skill. Between the two of them, they spoke a half-dozen languages, including Yiddish, German, Polish, and Hungarian, allowing them to effortlessly infiltrate the immigrant communities where much of the bootlegging action was happening, and their commitment to disguise was absolute. They were the masters of undercover work. They posed as streetcar conductors, opera singers, lawyers, fishermen, and on one occasion, a whole team of football players, with the short, stout Izzy hiding in the middle of the huddle. Izzy once got a bartender to serve him a drink by walking in with a trombone, claiming he was thirsty after a long rehearsal. Their methods were a brilliant blend of deception and pure chutzpah. Izzy's favorite trick was to walk into a suspected speakeasy, slap a chemistry beaker down on the bar, and announce in a thick German accent that he was a chemist who needed to test the specific gravity of his beverage. The bartender, assuming he was a fellow bootlegger checking his latest batch of rot gut, would proudly pour a glass of his own illegal hooch for comparison. Izzy would then pull out his badge and say, "You're under arrest." It was so ridiculous. It worked almost every time, and they were relentless. They were a two-man whirlwind of enforcement. They set a personal record in New Orleans, a city famous for its lax attitude, by getting served an illegal drink just 35 seconds after stepping off the train. In their 5.5-year career, Izzy and Mo made 4,930 arrests. Their conviction rate was a staggering 95%. They single-handedly confiscated an estimated 5 million bottles of illegal liquor. They weren't just agents. They were a phenomenon. The newspapers loved them. Their latest bust, their newest ridiculous disguise, it was front-page news. They became national folk heroes, the smiling, public face of a failing federal policy. This brings us to a critical question in a system designed to fail. Why did these two succeed so spectacularly? Cause the overwhelming majority of Prohibition agents were ineffective because they were either corrupt, incompetent, or easily identifiable as law enforcement. Effect: to highly unusual agents, Izzy Einstein and Mo Smith leveraged their unassuming appearances, mastery of languages, and a genius for creative disguises to bypass the defenses of the criminal underworld. Consequence: they became the most successful law enforcement duo of the era, achieving a celebrity status that provided a rare public relations win for the Prohibition Bureau. However, their fame also starkly highlighted the incompetence of their colleagues and proved that effective enforcement was the rare exception, not the rule. Their greatest asset, even more than the disguises, was their honesty in an agency drowning in graft. Izzy and Mo were famously incorruptible. Bootleggers tried to bribe them constantly, but they never took a dime. This made them not just a nuisance, but a genuine threat. And in the world of government bureaucracy, being too good at your job can be a dangerous thing. Their fame and their spotless record were a constant embarrassment to their less effective and often corrupt fellow agents and superiors. They were making everyone else look terrible. So, in 1925, at the absolute peak of their fame and effectiveness, the Prohibition Bureau fired both of them. The official reason was a bland reorganization of the service. The real reason was pure professional jealousy. Izzy and Mo, the two most successful agents in the country, were let go because their success was too loud, too flashy, and too much of an indictment of the system's failures. The story of Izzy and Mo is the perfect microcosm of the entire Prohibition enforcement effort. A brief, shining, almost comical moment of success in a vast sea of failure. It shows that the only way to effectively police an unpopular law was with the tactics of a vaudeville show. And it proved that the bureaucracy created to enforce the law was more threatened by genuine success than by catastrophic failure. The system didn't want heroes, it wanted plausible deniability. Izzy and Mo were a wonderful distraction, but they were just two men. The real story of Prohibition enforcement wasn't about the two agents who couldn't be bought. It was about the thousands upon thousands who could. The real fight wasn't a battle of wits. It was a battle of the wallet. The tale of Izzy and Mo is a great story, a heroic David versus Goliath narrative. But it's a distraction. They were the honest men in an ocean of corruption so deep it threatened to drown the entire American justice system. For every Izzy Einstein who refused a bribe, there were 100 other cops, agents, and judges who had their hands out, eagerly waiting for their cut of the action. The real story of Prohibition enforcement isn't about the fight against crime. It's about the business of it, and business was booming. The fundamental problem was a simple, brutal economic equation. The illegal liquor trade was a multi-billion-dollar industry. The people tasked with shutting it down were, by and large, absurdly underpaid. A beat cop in Chicago might make $40 a week. A federal prohibition agent's starting salary was around $1,800 a year. Meanwhile, Al Capone could offer that same cop $100 more than 2 weeks' pay, just to look the other way. While a beer truck rolled down his street, it wasn't a fair fight. It was an economic mismatch of epic proportions, and so the system rotted. It rotted from the bottom up and from the top down, until the rule of law in many American cities was little more than a suggestion. It started on the street. The beat cop was the first line of defense and the first to fall for a steady cash payment. A cop would forget to patrol a certain block where a speakeasy was operating. He might act as a lookout, tipping off the bar owner when federal agents were in the neighborhood. Some even moonlighted as security for the bootleggers, riding shotgun on liquor trucks to wave them through police checkpoints. The police weren't fighting crime, they were a subscription service for it. The federal prohibition agents, the supposed elite force, were often worse. The Prohibition Bureau was a revolving door of corruption. It's estimated that at least 1 in every 12 agents was fired for taking bribes, and that's just the ones who got caught. An agent on the take could do far more damage than a cop. They could sell a list of planned raids to the local syndicate. They could sell confiscated, high-quality liquor to other bootleggers, creating a government-sponsored black market. They could lose key evidence or botch their testimony in court, ensuring a gangster walked free. And that brings us to the courts. The corruption didn't stop at the courthouse steps. It owned a seat on the bench. Syndicates had judges and prosecutors on retainer. A gangster with enough money could get almost any charge dismissed on a flimsy technicality. Juries could be bought or intimidated. The entire judicial process became a theatrical performance. The arrests were for show. The trials were a farce, and the acquittals were a foregone conclusion. The scales of justice weren't just tilted, they had been melted down and sold for scrap. This systemic rot is the final piece in the puzzle of how men like Al Capone became untouchable. Cause the astronomical profits of bootlegging created a financial incentive for corruption that complete lie overwhelmed the low salaries of law enforcement and judicial officials. Effect: crime syndicates invested millions in systematically bribing every level of government, from the cop on the beat to the federal judge and the city mayor, effectively purchasing a private system of immunity. Consequence: the American legal system in major cities effectively collapsed. Public trust in law enforcement and government evaporated, and the gangsters operated not in the shadows, but in broad daylight, secure in the knowledge that they were above the very law they were breaking. In places like Chicago, it was an art form. Capone didn't just bribe individuals. He bought the whole system. He had a standardized price list for payoffs, a budget line item for graft. When he said, "I own the police," it wasn't a boast, it was a simple statement of fact. A line item on his balance sheet. He had created a vertically integrated corporation of crime, and its most crucial subsidiary was the government of Chicago. And here is the most corrosive, insidious truth about the noble experiment: the law itself was the poison. Prohibition didn't just reveal corruption, it manufactured it. It created a moral and ethical trap for hundreds of thousands of public servants. It presented them with a choice: uphold a deeply unpopular and widely ignored law for a pittance, risking your life in the process, or take a bribe that could be worth more than your yearly salary and secure your family's future. The law was written to make America more moral, but in practice, it made corruption the most logical and rational choice available. It turned cops into criminals and turned the justice system into just another racket. With the law so thoroughly bought and paid for, the gangsters were free to operate with impunity. They could run their smuggling rings and breweries without much fear of any real legal consequences. But the most sophisticated criminals didn't just work around the law by breaking it. They found ways to work within the law, twisting its own bizarre loopholes into new and even more profitable ventures. The most lucrative of these wasn't about sneaking whiskey across the border. It was about diverting a perfectly legal substance that the entire country was swimming in. It was time to exploit the world of industrial alcohol. With the cops and courts on their payroll, the crime syndicates had neutralized the legal system. But the truly brilliant minds of the underworld knew that the best way to beat the law was to use it against itself. They found the biggest, most dangerous, and most profitable loophole of all, not in a back alley or on the high seas, but right in the pages of the Volstead Act itself, the industrial alcohol exception. Here's the setup for this spectacular grift. Pure alcohol, ethanol, is one of the most important chemicals. In the modern world, it's a crucial ingredient in everything from perfumes and cosmetics to antifreeze, paint, and medical supplies. Banning it completely would have shut down a huge portion of the American economy, so the Volstead Act made a special exception. The production of industrial-grade alcohol was 100% legal. The government allowed factories to produce millions upon millions of gallons of it. There was just one catch: to prevent people from just taking this industrial supply and drinking it, the government required that it be denatured. This is a fancy word for a simple process. You add poison to it. The government mandated that companies mix their legal, industrial-grade ethanol with a cocktail of toxic chemicals like formaldehyde, iodine, or, most commonly, deadly methanol. The government literally provided the poison recipes. The idea was to make the alcohol so vile and so dangerous that no sane person would ever dream of drinking it. They severely underestimated the American people's determination to get a buzz. For the bootlegging syndicates, this wasn't a problem, it was an instruction manual. They orchestrated a massive, nationwide shell game. Step 1. Create a legitimate-looking front. A gangster would set up a company on paper, the Acme Perfume Company, or the Standard Shoe Polish Corporation. This fake company would then apply for and receive a federal license to purchase tens of thousands of gallons of denatured industrial alcohol for their manufacturing needs. Step 2. Divert the supply. A tanker truck full of the government-approved poison alcohol would be legally shipped to the Acme Perfume Company's address, which was usually just a rented garage or an empty warehouse. The moment the truck arrived, the cargo was diverted directly into the syndicate's illegal supply chain. The perfume company would then declare bankruptcy, and the gangsters would open a new front company down the street. Step 3. Wash the poison out. This is where it gets really dangerous. The syndicate would hire rogue chemists to renature the alcohol through a crude process of redistillation and chemical washing. They would attempt to remove the toxic additives. Sometimes they were successful. Often, they were not. Step 4. Bottle and sell. This washed, and possibly still poisonous alcohol would be watered down, flavored with some juniper oil and glycerin to mimic gin, and poured into fancy-looking bottles with counterfeit labels of famous brands. This chemical cocktail was then sold to speakeasies across the country as the real deal. This industrial alcohol diversion scheme was the single largest source of liquor during Prohibition. The Volstead Act created a gaping loophole for the legal production of millions of gallons of industrial alcohol, which was then deliberately poisoned by government mandate to make it undrinkable. Effect: organized crime syndicates systematically exploited this by creating front companies to legally acquire this poison alcohol. They then employed amateur chemists to wash the toxins out, creating a massive supply of cheap, but often dangerous, bootleg liquor. Consequence: this became the primary engine of the national bootlegging industry, and the direct cause of the public health crisis of mass poisoning. The government's own policy of denaturing alcohol had inadvertently turned it into the chief supplier of the raw, toxic material for the mob's deadliest product. The sheer scale of this is mind-boggling. An estimated 60 to 70 million gallons of industrial alcohol were diverted every year. This wasn't a side hustle, this was the main pipeline. And it was this river of tainted booze that was blinding and killing thousands of Americans. The government knew it was happening. Their response: they ordered companies to add more and stronger poisons to the industrial alcohol, hoping that it would scare people away. It didn't. It just raised the body count. Let's just sit with the magnificent, perverse logic of this government policy for a second. The government's official strategy to promote public health was this: 1. Allow the legal production of a vast ocean of pure alcohol. 2. Force companies to mix that alcohol with deadly poison. 3. Watch as criminal organizations steal that poison. 4. Watch as they try to unpoison it. And 5. Act shocked when thousands of citizens are maimed and killed by drinking the resulting chemical sludge. It is a Rube Goldberg machine of death, a policy so catastrophically stupid it's a miracle it didn't kill more people. The industrial alcohol pipeline was a domestic gold mine, supplying the raw, uncut product that fueled the speakeasy boom. But the American consumer still craved the good stuff, real, professionally made, and most importantly, non-poisonous liquor. For the syndicates in the northern part of the country, especially in cities like Detroit and Chicago, the best source wasn't a chemical factory. It was just a few miles away, across a river or an invisible line on a map. It was time to go shopping in the great liquor store to the north, Canada. The American underworld was swimming in a river of its own toxic, chemically washed industrial alcohol. It was profitable, but it was poison. For the discerning drinker in the high-end speakeasy, nothing could replace the real thing: professionally distilled, properly aged, high-quality whiskey and gin. For the gangsters of the northern cities, the source of this golden river was just a stone's throw away. It was their quiet, polite, and very obliging neighbor, Canada. While the United States was tying itself in knots of moral purity, Canada was taking a much more pragmatic approach. They had dabbled with their own provincial prohibition laws, found them to be a spectacular failure, and had mostly repealed them by the early 1920s. This meant that while it was illegal to produce a bottle of beer in Cleveland, it was perfectly legal for massive distilleries and breweries in Windsor, Ontario, right across the river, to churn out millions of gallons of the finest rye whiskey and ale. This set the stage for one of the greatest economic windfalls in Canadian history. All thanks to a glorious legal loophole. Canadian law made it perfectly legal to manufacture and sell alcohol for the explicit purpose of export, where that liquor went after it was legally sold and loaded onto a boat was, according to the Canadian government, not their problem. If an American businessman showed up with a suitcase of cash and wanted to buy 1,000 cases of Canadian Club to export to Cuba, the distillers were happy to oblige, collect the money, and wave a cheerful goodbye as the boat immediately made a hard turn towards Detroit. And so, the 5,500-mile US-Canada border, the longest undefended border in the world, was transformed into a smuggler's superhighway. It was a sieve that the US government had no hope of plugging. The absolute epicenter of this cross-border trade was the Detroit-Windsor funnel. The Detroit River, just a mile wide in some places, became a 24/7 conveyor belt for booze. In the summer, smugglers used a fleet of high-speed boats, their engines muffled, to make the crossing in minutes. In the winter, the action didn't stop. When the river froze solid, a new industry of whiskey runners emerged, driving souped-up cars and trucks right across the ice, their headlights off, praying the ice wouldn't crack and that the few, freezing border agents wouldn't spot them. It is estimated that a staggering 75% of all the liquor smuggled into America during Prohibition came through this single, narrow channel. The result was an unprecedented economic boom. For Canadian border towns, distilleries like Hiram Walker and Windsor went from being successful businesses to global powerhouses. The Canadian government, while officially maintaining a stance of friendly neutrality, was happily collecting millions of dollars in export taxes on liquor it knew, with a wink and a nod, was destined for Al Capone's warehouses. Families like the Bronfmans, who founded the Seagram's empire, built immense fortunes by expertly navigating the legal gray area of supplying America's thirst. They weren't bootleggers, they were just the guys who sold the product to the bootleggers. It was a clean, legal, and fantastically profitable business. This is the international chain reaction that kept America's finest speakeasies in business. Cause the United States created an artificial market drought for high-quality liquor, while its immediate northern neighbor, Canada, had a thriving legal distilling industry and laws that conveniently allowed for its export. Effect, a massive, sophisticated smuggling network emerged along the entire US-Canada border, particularly across the Detroit River. Canadian distillers legally produced and sold millions of gallons of whiskey to exporters, who were, in reality, American crime syndicates. Consequence, the Canadian liquor industry became phenomenally wealthy. American gangsters secured a reliable and safe supply of premium product, and the US government was made to look utterly impotent as it failed to police an unpoliceable border. The Northern Pipeline made a mockery of the idea of a dry America. There's a certain dry Canadian humor to this entire situation. America throws this huge, dramatic, moralizing party for itself, called Prohibition, and Canada, the quiet neighbor upstairs, spends the whole night selling booze out the back door to all the guests. The Canadian government's official policy was a masterclass in passive-aggressive diplomacy. They would listen with a straight face to the complaints from Washington, promise to look into it, and then go right back to cashing the tax receipts from the distilleries. It was perhaps the most profitable and polite act of international trolling ever committed. With the Canadian pipeline flowing from the north, rum rose supplying the coasts, and industrial alcohol bubbling up from within, the supply side of the bootlegging business was locked down. The major crime syndicates now had a diverse and reliable portfolio of products, from cheap rot gut for the masses to premium imported whiskey for the elite. The market was established. The profits were flowing in a tidal wave of cash. But this is capitalism, even the criminal kind, and when multiple, powerful Heavily armed corporations are competing for the same limited market share. A stable peace is never an option. The table was set for the next phase of corporate consolidation. In the legitimate business world, this means price wars, mergers, and acquisitions. In the gangster economy of the 1920s, it meant something much simpler and much bloodier: all-out war. The bootlegging empires were built, the supply chains were humming, and the cash was flowing like a river of illegal whiskey. The criminal syndicates had become vast, powerful corporations, and now they were about to enter the next logical phase of corporate development, a series of extremely hostile takeovers. In the legitimate business world, you fight for market share with price cuts, advertising campaigns, and lawsuits. In the gangster economy of the 1920s, you did it with Tommy guns, car bombs, and sawed-off shotguns. The boardroom meetings were about to be replaced by street corner executions. This explosion of violence was the inevitable result of the industry's illegality. When your entire business is outside the law, you have no legal recourse. You can't sue a rival for breaking a contract. You can't call the police when someone hijacks your delivery truck. The only court you have is the court of the street, and the only judge is a hail of bullets. Violence wasn't just a byproduct of the bootlegging business. It was its primary tool for regulation, enforcement, and expansion. And the tools of that business got a terrifying upgrade. Before Prohibition, a gang fight might involve knives or a few pistols, but the obscene profits from bootlegging allowed the syndicates to arm themselves like a modern army. The signature weapon of the era, the one that became a symbol of gangster terror, was the Thompson submachine gun. The Tommy gun, or the Chicago typewriter as it was gruesomely nicknamed, was a weapon of war. It was light, portable, and could fire over 800 rounds a minute. It could tear a car, a brick wall, or a human being to shreds in seconds. The gangsters had these military-grade weapons long before most police departments did. They had achieved tactical superiority. The streets of American cities, especially Chicago, became the battlefield. The Chicago beer wars were a brutal, multi-year conflict for control of the city's billion-dollar liquor trade. On one side was Al Capone's South Side outfit, the rising Italian powerhouse. On the other was the established North Side Gang, a formidable crew of Irish and Polish gangsters. It was a clash of titans, and the body count was staggering. The war effectively kicked off in 1924, when Capone decided to eliminate the leader of the North Siders, the charismatic but hot-headed Diane O'Banion. O'Banion's legitimate business was a flower shop. One afternoon, 3 of Capone's top hitmen walked into the shop. O'Banion, thinking they were customers, reached out to shake one of their hands. The man gripped O'Banion's hand in a death lock, while the other pulled out their pistols and fired 6 shots, killing him instantly among the chrysanthemums. The message was clear: there were no safe spaces. Business was war. This assassination triggered a cycle of vengeance that bathed the city in blood. The North Siders, now led by the vengeful Jaime Weiss, retaliated with a tactic that the gangs would perfect: the drive-by shooting. In 1926, a convoy of North Side cars rolled past Capone's headquarters in the suburb of Cicero. They slowed down, and for a full minute, they unleashed a torrent of over 1,000 rounds of machine gun fire, riddling the building with bullets and nearly killing Capone, who had to dive for cover. Here is the brutal logic that turned city streets into war zones. Cause: the illegality of the bootlegging industry meant that all business disputes over territory, supply, or pricing could only be settled through violence. As there was no access to a legal system, effect, crime syndicates invested their massive profits in military-grade weapons like the Thompson submachine gun, and developed tactics of urban warfare, including drive-by shootings and targeted assassinations, to eliminate their competition. Consequence: open gang warfare erupted for control of lucrative urban markets, most famously in Chicago. The spectacular public violence resulted in hundreds of deaths, terrifying the public and making the direct link between Prohibition and a nationwide crime wave impossible to ignore. This is the raw, unfiltered essence of an unregulated market. It's capitalism with the gloves off and the safety switched off. The gang wars were a violent form of market correction. The syndicates that were the most ruthless, the best armed, and the most efficient at killing their rivals were the ones who survived and consolidated their power. Al Capone wasn't just a gangster, he was a master of monopolistic violence. He was building his empire by literally liquidating the competition. For a time, the American public watched this carnage with a kind of horrified fascination. The daily headlines screamed of new killings, but it was largely seen as an internal affair. It was gangsters killing other gangsters, a bloody but contained conflict within the underworld. The average citizen could still feel relatively safe. as long as they didn't own a speakeasy or try to horn in on Capone's territory. But that was about to change. One spectacular act of violence was coming, an event so cold, so brutal, and so meticulously planned that it would shatter the illusion of a contained war. It would be the bloody crescendo of the Chicago conflict, a massacre that would finally horrify the nation into action. The gang wars had turned Chicago's streets into a shooting gallery, but the public had grown numb to the daily drip of violence. It was a horrifying spectacle, but it was background noise. It was just bad guys killing bad guys. To truly shock the nation, to wake it from its cynical slumber, would require an act of violence so clinical, so audacious, and so utterly contemptuous of any human decency that it could not be ignored. That act would arrive on a cold winter morning, a bloody Valentine from Al Capone to his last remaining rival. The date was February 14, 1929. The target was George Bugs Moran, the hot-headed leader of the North Side Gang. Moran had been a persistent and painful thorn in Capone's side. Hijacking his finest whiskey shipments from Canada, Capone decided it was time for a final, decisive merger. He devised a plan that was as brilliant as it was brutal. He had an associate arranged to sell Moran a hijacked shipment of premium Canadian whiskey at a ridiculously low price. The deal was set to go down at 10:30 a.m. in a garage on North Clark Street. It was a trap, baited with the one thing a bootlegger couldn't resist, a bargain. Capone, ever the careful CEO, was miles away, establishing an ironclad alibi. He was at his winter home in Miami, Florida, ensuring he was seen by plenty of witnesses. He wanted everyone to know he was responsible for what was about to happen, but he wanted to make damn sure no one could ever prove it. Back in Chicago, the trap was sprung. 7 of Moran's top men, including his chief enforcers, were gathered inside the garage, waiting for the whiskey truck to arrive. A Cadillac, carefully chosen to look like an unmarked police detective's car, pulled up to the curb. 4 men stepped out. 2 were dressed in sharp civilian overcoats. The other 2 were wearing the full official uniforms of Chicago police officers inside the garage. Moran's crew heard the commotion and saw the uniforms. They instantly relaxed. This wasn't a rival gang's hit. It was just a police raid, a routine shakedown. They were used to this. They dropped their own weapons and casually lined up against the back wall, hands raised, probably expecting to pay a small bribe and be on their way. This was the dark genius of Capone's plan. He used the very symbol of law in order to disarm his enemies, turning their own corruption and cynicism against them. What happened next was not a raid. It was a firing squad. The 4 men pulled out their weapons, to Thompson submachine guns, a sawed-off shotgun, and a .45 caliber pistol. For 15 seconds, they systematically sprayed the 7 men against the wall, firing more than 70 rounds. It was a clinical, methodical slaughter. When the shooting stopped, the 2 men dressed as police officers marched the 2 men in civilian clothes out of the garage, with their hands in the air, a perfect piece of street theater for any potential witnesses. It looked like the police had the situation under control. They all got into the fake police car and calmly drove away. In a final, bitter twist of irony, the one man they came to kill, Bugs Moran, had survived. He had been running late for the meeting. As he approached the garage, he saw the police car parked outside and, assuming it was a raid, ducked into a nearby coffee shop to wait it out. His tardiness saved his life. The chain reaction from this one event would change everything. Cause, in a final, brutal move to consolidate his power, Al Capone orchestrated a mass execution of his rival, the North Side Gang, using assassins disguised as police officers to ensure a swift, surprise attack. Effect: the St. Valentine's Day massacre was so cold-blooded and the crime scene so gruesome that photographs of the event shocked the entire nation. The use of police uniforms shattered any remaining public tolerance for gang violence, showing that the mob had grown powerful enough to mimic and mock the law itself. Consequence: the massacre became the ultimate symbol of Prohibition's failure. It destroyed the romantic image of the gangster and created immense public pressure on the federal government to stop making excuses and finally bring Al Capone to justice by any means necessary. The aftermath was a media firestorm. The photographs of the 7 bodies, slumped in a bloody heap against the bullet-pocked brick wall, were published in newspapers from coast to coast. This wasn't just another gangland shooting. This was different. This was a message. It was a display of such absolute power and such profound contempt for life that the public could no longer look away. The detached fascination with the celebrity gangster died that day, replaced by pure revulsion. This was the PR crisis from which the noble experiment would never recover. For years, A significant portion of the public had been willing to put up with the crime and corruption as the price of getting a drink. It was a trade-off. But the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was the bill presented in blood. It was the moment America looked at the full cost of its hypocritical law and finally decided the price was too high. The public outcry was deafening. In Washington, the newly inaugurated president, Herbert Hoover, was furious and embarrassed. The time for local, corrupt police to handle the problem was over. He instructed his Treasury Department to get Al Capone. He didn't care how. He just wanted him gone. The full weight of the federal government was about to descend on one man. The hunt was on. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was a brutal awakening, a splash of cold, bloody water to the face of a nation that had been trying to ignore the consequences of its own bad decisions. The feds were now on the hunt for Capone, and the tide of public opinion was turning against the mob. But to understand the full, magnificent absurdity of the Prohibition era, we have to zoom out from the crime scene. Because while the gangsters were busy turning Chicago into a war zone, the rest of America, or at least the young, urban part of it, was having the party of a lifetime. Prohibition wasn't just a failure of law enforcement. It was a catastrophic backfire of social engineering. The law was passed by a coalition of rural, Protestant, old-stock Americans who wanted to restore what they saw as traditional values. They were fighting against the rise of the modern, immigrant-filled, jazz-soaked city. They wanted to make America quiet, pious, and sober again. Instead, they accidentally invented the Roaring Twenties. They wanted a church revival. And they got a 13-year-long rave. By making alcohol illegal, they made it cool. They transformed the simple act of having a drink from a mundane pastime into an act of thrilling, sophisticated rebellion. This rebellion needed a headquarters, and it found one in the speakeasy. And inside the speakeasy, a full-blown cultural revolution was born. The icon of this revolution was the flapper. She was everything the pre-war woman was not supposed to be. She chopped off her long hair into a daring, boyish bob. She swapped her corset and floor-length dress for a straight, knee-length frock that was perfect for dancing. She wore makeup, smoked cigarettes in public, and drove a car. And most shockingly of all, she drank. In the speakeasy, side by side with men, she sipped cocktails from flasks and danced with a wild abandon that terrified the older generation. The flapper was the living, breathing embodiment of the new, liberated woman, and her natural habitat was the illegal bar that Prohibition had created. And every revolution needs a soundtrack. The official music of the Prohibition Rebellion was jazz. Born in the African-American communities of New Orleans, jazz was everything traditional music wasn't. It was loud, fast, improvisational, and deeply rhythmic. It was sensual and chaotic. The old guard hated it, calling it jungle music and the sound of moral decay, which, of course, only made the younger generation love it more. Speakeasies, especially those run by gangsters who cared only for the color green, became the primary venues that brought jazz to a massive, mainstream white audience. In the clubs of Harlem and Chicago, black musicians like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and King Oliver became superstars. Their brilliant trumpet solos and complex rhythms fueling the dance craze that swept the nation. The Charleston, the Black Bottom, the Lindy Hop, these were the physical expressions of the era's joyful defiance. This is the cultural chain reaction that nobody in the anti-saloon league saw coming. Cause, by criminalizing alcohol, Prohibition shifted the social act of drinking from public, male-only saloons, to secret, co-ed speakeasies, transforming it into an act of rebellion. Effect, this new, illicit social environment became an incubator for a wider cultural rebellion. Defying the ban on drinking became intertwined with defying other traditional norms and fashion. The flapper, music, jazz, and social behavior. Consequence, Prohibition inadvertently supercharged the cultural revolution of the Roaring Twenties. It created the very conditions that allowed a modern, urban, and defiant youth culture to flourish. A culture that was the polar opposite of the traditionalist society that Dries had intended to create. It is impossible to overstate the beautiful irony of this. The Dries wanted to strengthen the patriarchal family. Instead, they fueled female liberation by creating the co-ed speakeasy. They wanted to promote their vision of a white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant culture. Instead, they helped make an African-American art form jazz the most popular music in the country. They wanted to legislate a return to a nostalgic, agrarian past, and in doing so, they accidentally midwifed the birth of modern, urban nightlife. They swung for the fences trying to hit a home run for old-time morality, and ended up creating the Great Gatsby. It was the most spectacular, consequential, and culturally significant own goal in American history. But the party couldn't last forever. Outside the glamorous, smoke-filled walls of the speakeasies, the bill for this 13-year bender was coming due. The country was paying a heavy price, the violence was horrifying, the corruption was systemic, and the law itself was a global laughingstock. The very arguments that had been used to pass Prohibition, that it would reduce crime, empty prisons, and create a more virtuous society, were now demonstrably, laughably false. The noble experiment had failed, and people were starting to say so out loud. The triumphant Dries were suddenly on the defensive, and a new political force was rising to challenge them, the Wets. The battle for America's bars was about to begin all over again. The Roaring Twenties were a cultural powder keg, and Prohibition was the match that lit the fuse. But outside the glittering chaos of the speakeasies, the hangover was setting in. The grand promises of the Anti-Saloon League had curdled into a grim reality of crime, corruption, and poison. For the first few years of the noble experiment, the opposition was disorganized and weak, easily dismissed by the powerful dry lobby as a bunch of unpatriotic drunks and self-interested brewers. But as the body count rose and the headlines grew more horrific, a new, powerful, and well-organized opposition finally got its act together. The Wets were striking back. Their new strategy was brilliant. They stopped arguing about the morality of a single person having a beer. That was a losing battle against the righteous fury of the Dries. Instead, they changed the subject. They started arguing about the catastrophic results of the law itself. They took every promise the Dries had ever made and held it up against the grim reality of the 1920s, showing the American public just how badly they'd been scammed. The Dries had promised that Prohibition would reduce crime. The Wets pointed to Al Capone's bullet-riddled Chicago and asked, "How's that working out?" They used every gangland slaying, every drive-by shooting, as a fresh piece of evidence that Prohibition hadn't ended crime. It had professionalized it, militarized it, and turned it into a billion-dollar enterprise. The Dries had promised Prohibition would end corruption. The Wets pointed to the thousands of cops on the take, the judges in gangsters' pockets, and the mayors who were little more than mob puppets. They argued that the law had become the single greatest corrupting influence in American history, destroying public faith in the very institutions of government. The Dries had promised a more prosperous, efficient nation. The Wets pointed to the economic costs. The government was spending millions of dollars a year on a hopelessly failed enforcement effort. At the same time, it was losing out on hundreds of millions, eventually billions, in potential tax revenue from alcohol sales. The money wasn't going to the U.S. Treasury, it was going into Al Capone's armored cars. Finally, the Wets leaned hard on the argument of personal liberty. This was America, the land of the free. What right did the federal government have to act as a national nanny, peering into people's private lives and dictating their personal choices? They framed Prohibition not as a noble experiment, but as a tyrannical, un-American overreach of government power, a violation of the very principles the country was founded on. This new, coherent message needed a powerful messenger. The old Brewers Associations were tainted by self-interest. The new face of the repeal movement was the Association Against the Prohibition Amendment, or AAPA. This was no grassroots organization, it was a heavyweight lobbying group, funded by some of the wealthiest and most powerful industrialists in the country, including the DuPont brothers. They were slick, professional, and they used the exact same single-issue pressure tactics that the Anti-Saloon League had pioneered, turning the Dries' own weapons against them. This is the chain reaction that began the end of Prohibition. Cause: the undeniable and spectacular failures of Prohibition: unprecedented crime, systemic corruption, and a widespread loss of respect for the law provided a powerful arsenal of arguments against the 18th Amendment. Effect: a well-funded and politically savvy anti-prohibition movement. The Wets coalesced, masterfully shifting the national debate from the morality of drinking to the disastrous practical consequences of the law. Consequence: public opinion began to turn decisively against Prohibition. The Wets successfully rebranded the 18th Amendment from a noble experiment into a direct threat to American liberty, safety, and economic sense, creating the political momentum that would ultimately lead to its repeal. The political jiu-jitsu at play here is just beautiful to watch. For decades, the Dries had won by brilliantly framing one single thing: the saloon as the scapegoat for all of society has problems. Poverty: the saloon's fault. Crime: the saloon's fault. Unhappy families: the saloon's fault. Now, the Wets took that exact playbook and just swapped out the villain. Soaring crime rates: Prohibition's fault. Corrupt politicians: Prohibition's fault. Disrespect for the law: Prohibition's fault. It was the same argument, just in reverse. They proved a timeless political lesson: if you want to win, find a simple, emotionally satisfying target for everyone's anger, for a new generation of Americans. That target was now the 18th Amendment. The battle lines were drawn, the Wets had the arguments, the funding, and the momentum of public opinion. The Dries, however, still held immense political power. Deeply entrenched in rural and religious communities, it was going to be a brutal political fight, but the Wets had a secret weapon, an ally so unexpected and so powerful that the Dries would be left completely dumbfounded, unable to fight back. The greatest voice in the crusade for repeal would come from the very group of people who had, a decade earlier, been the heart and soul of the crusade to create prohibition in the first place. The Wet movement was gaining ground, armed with a powerful case against prohibition built on a foundation of crime and corruption. The Dries, for the first time in decades, were on the defensive, but their core belief remained unshaken. They were on a mission from God, and they were not about to surrender. Pushed into a corner and watching their grand social experiment crumble, the most zealous leaders of the Dry movement made a final, desperate, and monstrously cynical decision. If the American people would not listen to reason, they would have to learn their lesson through fear, and if that fear had to be lethal, so be it. The government's biggest enforcement headache was the industrial alcohol loophole. Millions of gallons of legally produced, denatured alcohol were being diverted, washed, and sold by bootleggers. The government's attempts to police this were failing miserably, so in late 1926, the Treasury Department, under immense pressure from hardline Dries like Wayne Wheeler, decided on a new strategy. If they couldn't stop the diversions, they would make the product so deadly that no one would dare to drink it. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't an unintended consequence. It was a deliberate, calculated policy of chemical warfare waged by the United States government against its own citizens. The federal government ordered industrial alcohol manufacturers to change their denaturing formulas. They were instructed to stop using less harmful additives and to start using a cocktail of much more lethal poisons, including kerosene, gasoline, and most horrifically, a massive increase in the percentage of methyl alcohol, or methanol. Methanol, as we know, is a vicious neurotoxin. It leads to paralysis, agonizing internal bleeding, irreversible blindness, and a painful, convulsive death. And the government knew this. They were fully aware that bootleggers were imperfect chemists and that this poison would inevitably find its way into the glasses of thousands of Americans. They had made the cold calculation that a few thousand dead citizens was an acceptable price to pay for the enforcement of sobriety. The results were immediate and catastrophic. Just after Christmas in 1926, over the holiday weekend, dozens of people in New York City's poorer neighborhoods died in agony after drinking the newly poisoned liquor. The city's chief medical examiner, Charles Norris, was horrified. He launched a public crusade against the policy, holding press conferences and calling it what it was: deliberate poisonings. And our national experiment in extermination. The death toll mounted nationwide. It's impossible to know the exact number, but historians estimate that the government's poisoning program was directly responsible for the deaths of at least 10,000 American citizens and the permanent injury of countless more. This is the moment the noble experiment plunged into the abyss. Cause: desperate to stop the unstoppable tide of industrial alcohol diversion, the U.S. government made the deliberate policy decision to make the substance far more deadly. Effect: manufacturers were ordered to denature alcohol with high concentrations of lethal methanol, leading to a massive spike in deaths and injuries as this government-mandated poison entered the bootleg liquor supply. Consequence: the policy created a massive public outrage. It was no longer possible to frame prohibition as a well-intentioned failure. The government was now a knowing accomplice to mass murder, destroying any remaining moral authority the Dry movement possessed and turning even moderate citizens violently against the law. The political fallout was immense. The Wets had been handed the ultimate weapon. They could now accuse the government, rightly, of being murderers. How could this experiment possibly be called noble when it involved a state-sanctioned program to kill its own people? The headlines were brutal. The stories of blind victims and grieving families were heartbreaking. But the response from the most ardent Dries was, somehow, even more shocking. Wayne Wheeler, the architect of Prohibition, publicly defended the policy. He stated that the people who drank bootleg liquor were deliberate suicides and that the government was under no obligation to protect the lives of citizens who broke the law. And there it is, the mask of moral righteousness completely disintegrated, revealing the fanatical, cold-hearted zealotry beneath. This was the true face of the crusade. It was no longer about saving the drunkard from a life of sin. It was about punishing him with death for his transgression. It was the logic of a holy war, not a public health campaign. The government had started out with the goal of saving America's soul. It had ended up actively poisoning its body. This was not a policy, it was an atrocity. This moral bankruptcy was the final straw for millions of Americans who had been on the fence, who had perhaps even supported the idea of prohibition in principle. This was a point of no return. The argument was no longer about personal choice versus public good. It was now about a government that had grown so monstrous in the pursuit of an impossible ideal that it had declared war on its own people. This horrifying reality would galvanize a new army for the cause of repeal, an army that the Dries never saw coming and had no idea how to fight. The US government was now in the business of poisoning its own people, a moral and ethical implosion that turned public opinion firmly against the noble experiment. The Dries, defending the indefensible, had lost all credibility, but the final, decisive blow against prohibition wouldn't come from a gangster's Tommy gun or a politician's speech. It would come from the ticker tape machines on Wall Street. On October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed, and the dizzying, jazz-fueled party of the Roaring Twenties came to a sudden, catastrophic end. The Great Depression descended upon America like a biblical plague. Banks failed, factories shuttered, fortunes vanished overnight. By the early 1930s, a quarter of the American workforce was unemployed. Millions of people were homeless, hungry, and desperate. The nation was plunged into the worst economic crisis in its history. And in the cold, hard light of this new reality, the debate over prohibition was completely transformed. For a decade, the country had argued about abstract concepts, morality, sin, personal liberty, and the soul of the nation. Suddenly, those arguments seemed like a decadent luxury. When you're standing in a bread line, you're not debating theology, you're thinking about money and jobs, and the government, which was now broke, was thinking the exact same thing. The wet movement, which had already been gaining steam, saw its moment. It seized on the economic crisis and brilliantly reframed the entire argument for repeal. This was no longer just a fight to bring back bars. It was a crusade to save the American economy. Their logic was simple, powerful, and, in the face of national devastation, impossible to ignore. First, there was the issue of taxes. The federal government was facing a massive budget deficit. Income tax revenues had plummeted. Where could they get more money? The Wets had an answer: tax the booze. They produced study after study showing that a federal tax on legalized beer, wine, and liquor could generate hundreds of millions, perhaps even $1 billion a year in new revenue. This wasn't just sin tax money anymore. This was money to fund desperately needed unemployment relief, to pay for public works projects, to balance the budget. The slogan practically wrote itself: tax beer, not bread. Then there was the promise of jobs. With 25% unemployment, the prospect of instantly reviving an entire industry was like a prayer being answered. The Wets painted a vivid picture of economic renewal. Legalizing alcohol wouldn't just bring back the brewers and distillers. It would create a cascade of employment. You'd need glassmakers to make the bottles, coopers to make the barrels, printers for the labels, and factory workers for the bottling plants. You'd need thousands of truck drivers and railroad men to transport it all. And of course, you'd need an army of construction workers to build the new breweries and taverns, and a legion of bartenders and waiters to staff them. Repeal was pitched as the ultimate, privately funded stimulus package. This is the economic chain reaction that sealed prohibition's fate. Cause: the Great Depression created an unprecedented economic crisis, making mass unemployment and a catastrophic drop in government tax revenue the nation's most urgent problems. Effect: the Wet movement masterfully shifted its focus, arguing that repealing prohibition was a direct solution to the crisis. They presented legalization as a powerful tool to create thousands of jobs and generate billions in desperately needed tax dollars. Consequence: the economic argument for repeal became politically overwhelming. It made the Dries moral arguments sound frivolous and out of touch, convincing a desperate public and a broke government that the noble experiment was an economic luxury the country could no longer afford. The Dries tried to fight back, but their arguments rang hollow. They claimed, with a straight face, that prohibition had been a great economic boon because people were spending their money on radios and refrigerators instead of alcohol. In a country filled with Hoovervilles and soup kitchens, this was so divorced from reality it was laughable. The moral certainty that had fueled the crusade for a generation melted away in the face of economic desperation. It's truly incredible how quickly a national crisis can change a conversation. For 10 years, The country was locked in a bitter culture war, then the economy collapsed. And the moral crusade was over. The debate was now about dollars and cents, about jobs and taxes. The Great Depression didn't just bankrupt the country's finances. It bankrupted the entire moral framework of the Prohibition movement. It proved, in the most brutal way imaginable, that when people are fighting for their survival, they don't have time for a sermon. They need a paycheck, and if legalizing beer could provide one, then so be it. The Dries were now politically shattered. Their moral authority was gone. Their economic arguments were a fantasy. The public had abandoned them. The end was near, but the final, most poetic blow would be delivered by an entirely new and unexpected army of repeal advocates, a group that would dismantle the last vestiges of the Dries' political power with surgical precision. The Dry movement was on the verge of collapse. Their moral crusade had devolved into a government-run poisoning program. Their economic promises had dissolved in the acid bath of the Great Depression. They were losing the argument, losing the public, and about to lose their grip on Washington. The final, fatal blow would come from the one place they never saw it coming. It would come from their own greatest allies, the women of America. For decades, the political calculus had been simple. Women were the engine of the Prohibition movement. Organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union had successfully framed the fight against alcohol as a sacred duty to protect the family, the home, and the children. They were the moral conscience of the nation, and politicians were terrified of crossing them. When women got the right to vote in 1920, it was widely assumed that the female vote would be a permanent, unshakable voting bloc for the Dry cause. This assumption was about to be spectacularly proven wrong. The rebellion was led by a woman named Pauline Sabin, and she was the Dry's worst nightmare. Sabin was not a flapper or a radical. She was a prominent, wealthy, well-connected Republican socialite. She was a wife, a mother of 2 sons, and crucially, a former supporter of Prohibition. She had worked to elect Dry politicians. She had believed in the cause, but by the late 1920s, she looked at the world Prohibition had created and was horrified. Her breaking point, she claimed, was realizing the profound hypocrisy the law was teaching her children. She saw that Prohibition hadn't made alcohol disappear. It had made it glamorous and exciting. It had replaced the corner saloon with the secret speakeasy, a place that was far more alluring to a rebellious teenager. She argued that the noble experiment was teaching an entire generation of young Americans that it was okay to break the law, that it was sophisticated to lie, and that their own government was a joke. In her eyes, the law designed to protect children was now actively endangering their moral character. In 1929, Sabin founded the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform, or the WONPR, and it became a political powerhouse. Its tactics were a brilliant inversion of the WCTU's. The WONPR didn't smash bars with hatchets. They organized debutante balls and fundraising teas in Park Avenue penthouses. They used their immense social networks and wealth to build a nationwide organization that, within a few years, had over 1 million members, far outnumbering the aging WCTU. They were sophisticated, they were relentless, and they were respectable. They turned the Dry's own arguments inside out, with devastating effect. Cause, a new generation of politically active women, many of them mothers and former Dry's, concluded that Prohibition was a catastrophic failure that was fostering a culture of crime, hypocrisy, and disrespect for the law, which they saw as a greater threat to their families than legal alcohol. Effect, led by Pauline Sabin, they formed the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform, a powerful and socially prominent group that brilliantly co-opted the pro-family and pro-child rhetoric previously owned by the Dry's. Consequence, the WONPR systematically dismantled the myth that all respectable women supported Prohibition. This provided crucial political cover for politicians to switch their allegiance to the wet cause, neutralizing the Dry's most potent voting bloc and signaling that the moral consensus behind the 18th Amendment had completely shattered. The WONPR argued that they were fighting for repeal for the sake of the children. They wanted to bring alcohol out of the shadows and back into the light, where it could be regulated, controlled, and stripped of its illicit glamour. They argued that true temperance, meaning moderation, was impossible in a world of extremes where the only choices were total abstinence or binge drinking bathtub gin in a secret club. This is the ultimate poetic justice of the Prohibition saga. The political force that gave birth to the 18th Amendment was the organized, moral outrage of American women, and the political force that would ultimately kill it was the organized, pragmatic outrage of a new generation of American women. It was a stunning reversal. The Dry's had built their entire political identity around being the protectors of motherhood and the American home. Now, the WONPR, an army of impeccably dressed, high society mothers, was calling them out. Stealing their moral high ground right out from under them, the Dries had no idea how to respond. How do you attack a group whose main argument is that they were just trying to protect their kids? The political landscape was now completely transformed. The public was against prohibition. The economic crisis made repeal a practical necessity, and now, the Dries' core constituency of respectable women had not only defected, but had organized a powerful counter-movement. All the pieces were in place. The only thing missing was a national leader willing to stake his career on ending the noble experiment once and for all. That leader was about to step onto the stage, promising a new deal for a suffering nation, and part of that deal would be a nice, cold, and most importantly, legal glass of beer. The table was set for the final act of this national tragicomedy. The public was furious. The economy was in ruins. The moral authority of the Dries had been washed away in a river of government-sanctioned poison and gangster-fueled hypocrisy. The country was a powder keg of discontent, waiting for a leader to light the fuse of repeal. That moment would be the presidential election of 1932. In one corner, you had the incumbent, President Herbert Hoover. Hoover was a man drowning in the historical tide, forever blamed for the Great Depression, but he was also saddled with another political anchor. He was a staunch, unwavering Dry. He clung to the belief that prohibition was a great social and economic experiment, noble in motive, even as the evidence of its catastrophic failure was burning down the world around him. He was a man trying to sell a failed social policy to a nation whose economy had already failed. It was a losing hand. In the other corner was the challenger, the charismatic and supremely confident governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR was a political shark who could smell blood in the water from a mile away. He saw a country desperate for radical change, and he understood that the seething hatred for prohibition was inseparable from the seething hatred for the economic collapse. While not a crusader on the issue personally, he was a pragmatist. And pragmatically, repealing prohibition was the smartest, easiest, and most popular promise he could possibly make. At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, the party made it official. For the first time, a major party platform included a plank explicitly calling for the repeal of the 18th Amendment. When Roosevelt took the stage to accept the nomination, he didn't mince words. He broke with tradition by flying to the convention in person, a symbol of his energy and modern approach. And he gave the people what they wanted to hear. I say to you, he boomed, that from this day on, the 18th Amendment is doomed. The crowd went absolutely wild. This wasn't just a political position. It was a declaration of war on the last 13 years of misery. The campaign that followed was a study in contrast. Hoover's campaign was grim, defensive, and backward-looking. He was the candidate of the status quo in an era when the status quo was an epic disaster. Roosevelt's campaign, powered by its theme song Happy Days Are Here Again, was a whirlwind of optimism. He promised a new deal for the American people, and a central, tangible part of that new deal was the promise of a cold, legal beer. This is the political chain reaction that brought down the curtain. Cause, the 1932 election pitted the unpopular Dry incumbent Herbert Hoover, who was blamed for the Great Depression, against the charismatic wet challenger Franklin D. Roosevelt. Effect, FDR astutely merged the economic and social frustrations of the nation, making the repeal of prohibition a cornerstone of his New Deal platform. He promised that repeal would bring jobs, tax revenue, and a return to personal freedom. Consequence, Roosevelt won in one of the most crushing landslide victories in American history. The election served as an undeniable national referendum on prohibition, giving FDR and the Democratic Party a massive public mandate to dismantle the 18th Amendment with all possible speed. The results on election night were a political bloodbath. Roosevelt won 42 of the 48 states. It was a complete and total repudiation of Hoover and the Republican Party's platform. But more than that, it was a nationwide roar of approval for repeal. A thirsty, angry, and broke nation had spoken with one voice. They wanted a new president, a new economy, and a new drink. FDR's embrace of repeal wasn't just good policy, it was a stroke of political genius. In a time of terrifyingly complex problems, banking collapses, agricultural failures, global instability, the promise to bring back beer was refreshingly simple. It was a concrete, easily understood action that symbolized a complete break with the failed past. It was a promise of a return to normalcy, a small pleasure in a time of great suffering. After a decade of moralizing sermons from the Dries, FDR stepped up to the podium and essentially offered to buy the country around, and the country gratefully accepted. With this overwhelming mandate, President-elect Roosevelt was ready to act. But the 18th Amendment was still carved into the Constitution. The formal process of repealing it would take time, requiring a new amendment to be passed by Congress and ratified by the states. Roosevelt, however, was not a patient man, and the country was even less so. The tax revenue and the jobs couldn't wait. The people had been promised beer, and he intended to give it to them as soon as humanly possible, even before the ink on the 21st Amendment was dry. The end was no longer a question of if, but how fast. Franklin Roosevelt had a landslide victory and a clear mandate to kill Prohibition. But a constitutional amendment is not a law you can just erase with a presidential pen. It's the bedrock of the nation's legal system, and repealing one is a slow, grinding process designed to be difficult. But FDR and the American people were done with being patient. They wanted action, and they wanted it now. So, they devised a brilliant punch combination to knock out the 18th Amendment in record time. Punch number 1 was the appetizer, a delicious down payment on the promise of repeal. Roosevelt wasn't even president yet, but in the lame duck session before his inauguration, the new wet majority in Congress got to work. They exploited a glorious bit of legal sophistry. The 18th Amendment banned intoxicating liquors, but it never actually defined the word intoxicating. That job had been left to the Volstead Act, which had set the absurdly low limit of 0.5% alcohol, but the Volstead Act was just a regular law, not an amendment, and what Congress can make, Congress can change. So, in March 1933, just days after FDR took office, Congress passed the Cullen-Harrison Act. This new law simply amended the Volstead Act, declaring that beer and wine with an alcohol content of up to 3% by weight were officially not intoxicating. Just like that, with a stroke of a pen, beer was legal again. Upon signing the bill, Roosevelt flashed his famous grin and delivered one of the most iconic lines in presidential history. "I think this would be a good time for a beer." The country erupted in celebration on April 7, 1933, the day the law went into effect. It was like New Year's Eve, Mardi Gras, and VJ Day all rolled into one. At 1 minute past midnight, brewery whistles screamed across the nation for the first time in 13 years. Trucks laden with barrels of Anheuser-Busch and Pabst, decorated with signs reading President Roosevelt, "We thank you," rolled through cheering crowds. People danced in the streets. It was a national holiday of pure, unadulterated relief, but this was just the beginning. While the nation was joyfully sipping its first legal 3-point beer, the main event was underway. Punch number 2 was the knockout blow, the 21st Amendment, which would repeal the 18th entirely. Congress passed it in February 1933 and sent it to the states for ratification. And they did something very clever. They stipulated that ratification had to be done not by the state legislatures, but by special state conventions. This was a stroke of political genius. It took the decision away from the entrenched, rural-dominated state houses, many still controlled by the dries, and gave it directly to the people, who would elect delegates specifically on this single issue. It was, in effect, a national referendum on prohibition. This is the chain reaction that brought the experiment to its official end. Cause, the new Roosevelt administration and a wet-dominated Congress needed to bypass the slow, traditional legislative process to deliver on their promise of repeal as quickly as possible. Effect, they first passed the Cullen-Harrison Act to immediately legalize beer. By changing its legal definition, simultaneously, they submitted the 21st Amendment to be ratified via state conventions, which allowed for a direct popular vote on the issue. Consequence, this two-pronged strategy led to the fastest constitutional repeal in American history. States rushed to ratify the amendment in a series of landslide popular votes, officially ending the noble experiment in a record-breaking 10 months, and what a race it was. State after state held their conventions, and the results were a political annihilation. The votes for repeal were not just majorities. They were landslides, 80% here, 90% there. The dries were utterly crushed. The American people, after 13 years of being dictated to, were finally given a choice, and they spoke in a single, deafening voice. The dominoes fell with breathtaking speed. Michigan was first, then Wisconsin, then New Jersey. The countdown was on. All year, the states fell until finally, on December 5, 1933, the nation's attention turned to, of all places, Utah. A convention of delegates in the conservative, heavily Mormon state cast the deciding vote. Utah became the 36th state to ratify the 21st Amendment. The 3/4 majority had been reached. A proclamation was immediately issued. The 18th Amendment was dead. Prohibition was over. The end of Prohibition is a remarkable story of democracy in action. The law was born out of the relentless pressure of a highly organized, fanatical minority that bent the political system to its will. But it died because of a direct, overwhelming roar from the majority. The use of state conventions was a brilliant maneuver that turned the ratification process into a pure expression of the popular will. After more than a decade of being treated like children, the American people were finally asked for their opinion, and their answer was clear, concise, and historic. The noble experiment was finally, mercifully, at an end, but 13 years of chaos, crime, and corruption had left a deep and permanent scar on the nation. The party was over, but the hangover was just beginning. On December 5, 1933, the news flashed across the country: Prohibition was dead. The noble experiment was over, and America threw a party in cities from New York to San Francisco. Sirens blared, confetti rained down, and hotel bars that had been shuttered for 13 years threw open their doors to massive, cheering crowds. The long national nightmare had ended. But when the party was over and the country woke up the next morning with a collective 13-year-long hangover, it had to face a hard question. What now? What was the lasting legacy of this disastrous and utterly failed experiment? The most significant and sinister legacy was the one that had been created in the shadows: modern, organized crime. The bootlegging syndicates, the criminal corporations of men like Al Capone and Meyer Lansky, did not simply pack up and go home when their flagship product became legal again. Why would they? Prohibition had been the greatest gift the government ever gave them. It had been their startup incubator, their venture capital, and their market research all in one. It had allowed them to build vast, nationwide empires, corrupt entire city governments, and accumulate staggering, untaxed fortunes. When repeal came, they simply did what any smart corporation does when its primary market changes: they pivoted. They took the immense profits, the sophisticated organizational structures, the political connections, and the army of violent enforcers they had built during Prohibition and reinvested it all into new ventures. They expanded their control over illegal gambling, loan sharking, and prostitution. They muscled their way into legitimate businesses, especially labor unions and the waste management industry, and most ominously, they laid the groundwork for the lucrative international drug trade. That would become their next great enterprise. Prohibition was over, but the national crime syndicate it had spawned was now a permanent and powerful feature of American life. On the other side of the coin, the chaos of Prohibition created the modern federal law enforcement apparatus. The spectacular failure of local police to handle the national crime wave gave the federal government the perfect justification to expand its own power. The small Bureau of Investigation, under the ambitious leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, was forged into the mighty FBI in the crucible of the 1930s gang wars. The war on gangsters like John Dillinger and Babyface Nelson was a direct consequence of the crime wave that Prohibition had unleashed. Furthermore, the government's single great victory over Al Capone, getting him on tax evasion, established the IRS's Criminal Investigation Division as one of the most feared and effective tools against the mob. The lesson was learned: if you can't get a gangster for murder, get him for his accounting. This is the final, paradoxical legacy of the whole affair. Cause the 13-year reign of illegal alcohol created a powerful, wealthy, and nationally organized criminal underworld. Effect: when Prohibition was repealed, these syndicates didn't dissolve, they diversified, using their Prohibition-era profits and infrastructure to dominate other illegal rackets for the rest of the 20th century. Consequence: Prohibition's most enduring legacy is a double-edged sword. It permanently established the modern corporate-style American mafia, and in response, it created a powerful centralized federal law enforcement system led by the FBI and IRS to combat it. The law designed to reduce crime ended up creating both the criminals and the cops, who would define the next 50 years of American justice. Culturally, the echoes of the era are still with us. The speakeasy killed the sawdust-floored, men-only saloon for good. When bars became legal again, they were the co-ed, cocktail-serving establishments that the speakeasy had pioneered. The image of men and women drinking together in public was now a normal part of American social life, and the entire experiment left the country with a deep and abiding distrust of sweeping, government-led moral crusades. In the end, the noble experiment stands as the ultimate cautionary tale. It is a story of unintended consequences, a perfect case study in how good intentions, when combined with moral arrogance and a profound misunderstanding of human nature, can lead to absolute disaster. The Crusaders who fought for Prohibition genuinely believed they were creating a better, safer, more virtuous America. But in their zeal to purify the nation, they were blind to the predictable chaos they were about to unleash. They wanted to eliminate the corner saloon, and instead, they gave us Al Capone. They wanted to protect the American family, and instead, they gave us the Tommy gun. They set out to write a new moral chapter in the nation's history, and ended up producing a 13-year-long crime wave. It is, and perhaps always will be, America's most spectacular self-inflicted wound. And that is how a bunch of well-intentioned moralists accidentally created the modern mafia and the cocktail party, all in one go. So, what did we learn? Mostly that trying to ban something that millions of people enjoy is a fundamentally terrible idea that tends to explode in your face. Please, for the love of all that is historically accurate, do not cite this podcast in your term paper. Your professor will cry, and we will not be held responsible for your failing grade. But if you had fun, tell us in the comments what other historical train wreck you want us to simplify next. The crazier, the better. And that's how that whole mess went down. Until next time, don't invade Russia in the winter.